Most people think they know George Orwell. They remember Big Brother and Animal Farm from high school English class. But George Orwell was far more than a novelist who wrote about totalitarian nightmares. He was one of the most profound political philosophers of the 20th century, a man who spent every waking moment thinking about truth, power, language, and human freedom. Eric Blair, the man who became George Orwell, lived through some of the most turbulent decades in human history. He witnessed the collapse of empires, the rise of totalitarian movements, and the betrayal of revolutionary ideals. Each of these experiences shaped his thinking in fundamental ways. He served as a colonial policeman in Burma, lived among the poorest people in Paris and London, fought in the Spanish Civil War, and watched as intellectuals across Europe abandoned truth for ideology. What emerged from all this was not just a collection of opinions, but a complete philosophical system. Orwell developed revolutionary ideas about the nature of truth, the relationship between language and thought, the proper organization of society, and the eternal struggle between individual freedom and collective power. His insights cut across every major area of human concern. He showed us how political systems shape our minds, how economic arrangements determine our possibilities, and how language itself can become a weapon of oppression. Today, we will explore every single aspect of Orwell's philosophical vision. We will see how his ideas about truth connect to his views on socialism, how his understanding of power relates to his theories about language, and how all of these elements combine into a unified worldview. This is not just intellectual history. These ideas remain urgently relevant to anyone trying to understand our current political moment. Orwell taught us that the battle for human freedom is fought first and foremost in the realm of ideas. The side that controls how people think will ultimately control how they live. Understanding Orwell's complete philosophy gives us the tools we need to recognize manipulation, resist propaganda, and preserve the possibility of independent thought. This knowledge has never been more essential than it is right now. Part 1. The Absolute Reality of Truth. George Orwell built his entire philosophical system on one bedrock principle that seems almost naive in our current age. He believed with complete conviction that objective truth exists in the world, independent of what anyone thinks or feels about it. This was not a casual belief for Orwell. It was the foundation that made everything else possible, from political action to moral judgment to meaningful human relationships. But Orwell came to this conviction through bitter experience, not abstract reasoning. During the Spanish Civil War, he watched journalists and intellectuals twist facts beyond recognition. Events that he had witnessed with his own eyes were denied, minimized, or completely fabricated in newspaper reports. Battles that never happened were described in vivid detail, while real atrocities were ignored or explained away. Orwell saw how ideology could make otherwise intelligent people blind to the most obvious realities. This experience shook him to his core. He began to worry that the very concept of objective truth was fading out of the world. People were starting to believe that truth was whatever served their political purposes. If your side said something happened, then it happened. If your side said it did not happen, then it did not happen. Facts became nothing more than weapons in an ideological war. This prospect frightened Orwell much more than bombs or bullets. Orwell understood that once a society loses its grip on objective truth, everything else collapses. Justice becomes impossible, because you cannot have fair trials without reliable evidence. Science becomes impossible because you cannot build knowledge without agreed-upon facts. Democracy becomes impossible because voters cannot make informed choices without accurate information. Even personal relationships become impossible because trust requires honesty. When truth dies, civilization dies with it. This is why the most famous line in 1984 is Winston Smith's declaration that freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. This simple mathematical fact represents something profound about the nature of reality. 2 + 2 = 4 regardless of what the party says, regardless of what is politically convenient, regardless of how many people believe otherwise. This truth exists independently of human opinion or desire. It cannot be voted away or decreed out of existence. It simply is. The party in 1984 tries to convince Winston that 2 + 2 can equal 5 if the party says so. They argue that reality exists only in the human mind, and since the party controls all minds, the party controls reality. This is not just a fictional dystopia. Orwell saw this exact same logic being used by totalitarian movements in his own time. Stalin would rewrite history books to erase his enemies from the record. Hitler would declare that repeated lies become truth if they are told often enough. But Orwell insisted that reality pushes back against these attempts to control it. You can convince people that 2 + 2 = 5, but bridges built using that mathematics will still collapse. You can deny that certain battles happened, but the dead bodies remain. You can claim that your economic policies are working, but people still go hungry. Reality has a way of asserting itself regardless of what anyone believes about it. This gives hope to those who refuse to abandon truth. Orwell believed that ordinary people have a natural capacity to recognize truth when they encounter it. Common sense provides a powerful defense against ideological manipulation. Simple observation reveals obvious facts about the world. Most people know that stones are hard, water is wet, and objects fall toward the earth when dropped. These basic truths cannot be argued away by clever intellectuals. They form a foundation that propaganda cannot destroy. The problem comes when people are trained to distrust their own observations. Totalitarian systems teach citizens that their personal experience means nothing compared to official doctrine. If you see something that contradicts the party line, you must have been mistaken. If your memory conflicts with the official record, your memory must be faulty. Gradually, people lose confidence in their own ability to distinguish truth from falsehood. They become dependent on authorities to tell them what is real. Orwell fought against this mental surrender throughout his entire career. He insisted that individual human beings have both the right and the responsibility to observe reality for themselves. No political party, no matter how powerful, can change the fundamental facts of existence. No ideology, no matter how sophisticated, can make lies into truth. The world exists independently of our thoughts about it. This independence is what makes genuine knowledge possible. This commitment to objective truth shaped every other aspect of Orwell's philosophy. His politics were based on honest observation of how different systems actually work in practice. His ethics were grounded in real human needs rather than abstract principles. His literary criticism focused on whether writers told the truth about human experience. Everything had to pass the test of reality. Ideas that sounded good but produced bad results were worthless. This is why Orwell could simultaneously support socialism and criticize socialist movements. He believed that socialism represented the truth about human equality and cooperation. But he also observed that many socialist organizations became corrupt authoritarian, and dishonest. The truth of socialist ideals did not excuse the falsehoods told by socialist leaders. Orwell refused to choose between truth and his political commitments. He insisted that real political progress was impossible without complete honesty about both successes and failures. Part 2. Language as the battlefield of the mind. George Orwell discovered something that philosophers had suspected but never fully understood. Language does not simply describe reality. Language actually shapes how we think about reality. The words available to us determine which thoughts we can have. This insight revolutionized Orwell's understanding of politics, because whoever controls language ultimately controls human consciousness itself. This is why every totalitarian movement in history has begun by redefining key words and phrases. Orwell observed this process firsthand during his time as a journalist and political writer. He watched politicians use language to make their opponents literally unable to express their ideas clearly. Complex political concepts would be reduced to meaningless slogans. Precise distinctions would be blurred by vague generalizations. Gradually, people would lose the ability to think clearly about political questions because they no longer had the linguistic tools necessary for clear thought. This was not an accident. Consider how political language works in practice. When politicians want to justify violence, they do not call it violence. They call it pacification or liberation or defensive action or police action or peacekeeping. When they want to describe their enemies, they do not use neutral terms. They use words that carry emotional charges. Rebels become terrorists, protesters become mobs, critics become traitors. Each word choice shapes how people feel about the underlying reality. Over time, the emotional associations become more powerful than the facts themselves. Orwell realized that this process could be pushed to its logical extreme. What if a government could control language so completely that certain thoughts became literally impossible to think? What if the words for rebellion, freedom, and individual rights simply disappeared from the language? What if concepts like justice and truth were redefined to mean whatever the government wanted them to mean? This is the terrifying vision behind Newspeak in 1984. It represents the ultimate form of thought control. Newspeak works by systematically reducing the number of words available to express ideas. Each year, hundreds of words are eliminated from the language. Synonyms are consolidated so that there is only one way to express each concept. Emotional and intellectual distinctions are flattened so that complex thoughts become impossible. Eventually, the language becomes so impoverished that people can only think in the most basic terms. They lose the capacity for nuanced reasoning, critical analysis, or independent judgment. But Orwell understood that you do not need a totalitarian government to achieve these effects. Language can be corrupted through simple laziness and intellectual cowardice. When people stop paying attention to the words they use, they gradually lose control of their own thoughts. They begin repeating phrases without understanding what they mean. They adopt the language of others without examining whether that language serves their own interests. Slowly but surely, their capacity for independent thought deteriorates. This is why Orwell placed such enormous emphasis on clear, precise writing. Good prose requires clear thinking, and clear thinking is the foundation of human freedom. When someone writes badly, they are usually thinking badly. When they think badly, they make bad decisions. When they make bad decisions, they create bad outcomes for themselves and others. The quality of language in a society directly determines the quality of thought, which directly determines the quality of life. Orwell developed specific techniques for protecting language from corruption. He insisted that writers should prefer concrete words to abstract ones, short words to long ones, and simple constructions to complex ones. They should avoid clichés, meaningless metaphors, and pretentious vocabulary. They should constantly ask themselves what they're actually trying to say, and whether their words express it clearly. Most importantly, they should never use language to conceal their real meaning from their readers or from themselves. Honesty in language leads to honesty in thought. These principles apply to everyone, not just professional writers. Every person who uses language has a responsibility to use it clearly and honestly. Every time someone repeats a meaningless phrase or accepts a false distinction, they contribute to the degradation of public discourse. Every time someone insists on precise definitions and accurate descriptions, they help preserve the conditions that make rational discussion possible. The battle for human freedom is fought one sentence at a time. Each of us participates in this battle every time we open our mouths or pick up a pen. Part 3. The corruption of language in politics. If language shapes thought, then those who want to control thought must first corrupt language. Orwell witnessed this process happening all around him during the 1930s and 40s. Political movements across the spectrum were discovering that they could manipulate public opinion by carefully controlling the words used to discuss important issues. This was not merely propaganda in the traditional sense. It was something far more insidious. It was the systematic destruction of the tools that people need to think clearly about politics. Orwell identified several specific techniques that politicians use to corrupt language. The first is the use of euphemisms to disguise unpleasant realities. Mass murder becomes ethnic cleansing. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. Invasions become police actions. Economic exploitation becomes development assistance. Each euphemism makes it a little bit harder for people to see what is actually happening. The emotional distance created by pleasant words reduces the moral urgency that people feel about terrible actions. The second technique is the deliberate vagueness of political language. Politicians learn to speak in terms so general that they cannot be proven wrong. They talk about freedom, democracy, justice and security without ever defining what these words mean. They promise progress, reform, change and improvement without specifying what will actually be different. This vagueness serves two purposes. It allows politicians to avoid making concrete commitments that could later be used against them. And it allows different listeners to imagine that the politician supports whatever they want him to support. Everyone hears what they want to hear. The third technique is the redefinition of familiar words to serve political purposes. Freedom comes to mean whatever the government says it means. Democracy becomes any system that claims to represent the people. Justice becomes whatever outcome serves the interests of the powerful. Peace becomes the temporary absence of open warfare. These redefinitions are never announced explicitly. They happen gradually, through consistent usage in political speeches, news reports and official documents. Eventually, people forget what these words originally meant. Orwell observed that intellectuals were particularly vulnerable to this type of linguistic manipulation. They prided themselves on using sophisticated language and complex ideas. This made them susceptible to arguments that sounded learned and profound, but actually meant nothing. Academic jargon became a way of avoiding clear thinking about difficult questions. The more abstract and theoretical the language became, the easier it was to ignore concrete realities. Intellectuals could discuss the dialectical processes of historical materialism while ignoring the fact that people were starving. Political language also becomes corrupted through the deliberate confusion of cause and effect. Politicians describe the results of their policies as if they were natural disasters beyond human control. Unemployment becomes a challenge rather than a failure. Poverty becomes a problem to be managed rather than an injustice to be corrected. War becomes an inevitable tragedy rather than a choice made by specific people for specific reasons. This passive voice construction removes human agency from political discussions. It makes it impossible to hold anyone accountable for the consequences of their decisions. Things just happen, apparently without anyone making them happen. Another form of corruption involves the multiplication of meaningless distinctions. Politicians create dozens of categories and subcategories that sound important but actually obscure the fundamental issues. Instead of talking about rich and poor, they talk about upper middle class, lower middle class, working class, and dozens of other classifications. Instead of discussing capitalism and socialism, they introduce mixed economies, social market systems, and democratic capitalisms. These distinctions may seem sophisticated, but they often prevent people from seeing the basic patterns of power and wealth. The multiplication of categories serves the interests of those who benefit from the status quo. Orwell also noticed how political language becomes infected with dying metaphors. Politicians use phrases like towing the line, riding roughshod, and fishing in troubled waters without thinking about what these images originally meant. The metaphors have lost their visual power, but they retain an emotional charge that affects how people feel about the ideas being discussed. These dead metaphors create the illusion of colourful speech while actually deadening the imagination. They allow politicians to sound poetic without saying anything meaningful. They substitute familiar sounds for fresh thinking. The cumulative effect of all these techniques is to create a political discourse that is almost completely divorced from reality. People argue passionately about words without ever examining whether those words correspond to anything real. They develop strong opinions about abstract concepts without understanding how those concepts relate to their actual lives. They become fluent in a specialized political vocabulary that prevents them from talking clearly about their concrete experiences. This is exactly what those in power want. Confused people are easier to control than people who understand what is being done to them. Orwell believed that the only defense against this corruption is constant vigilance about language. Every person must take responsibility for the words they use and the words they accept from others. When someone uses a euphemism, demand the plain truth. When someone speaks vaguely, insist on specific details. When someone redefines a familiar word, point out what it used to mean. When someone uses a dying metaphor, ask them to explain it in fresh language. This kind of intellectual self-defense requires constant effort, but it is essential for preserving the possibility of rational political discussion. Without it, democracy becomes impossible. Part 4. Democratic Socialism against Totalitarianism. George Orwell spent the second half of his adult life fighting a war on two fronts. He opposed totalitarianism in all its forms, whether fascist or communist. But he also opposed capitalism, which he saw as inherently unjust and ultimately unsustainable. This left him defending a middle position that many people found difficult to understand. He called himself a democratic socialist, but his version of socialism was unlike anything being practiced by socialist movements of his time. It was based on freedom rather than control, on decency rather than ideology, and on human needs rather than abstract theories. Orwell came to socialism through direct observation of poverty and inequality. His experiences living among the poor in Paris and London showed him that capitalism creates unnecessary suffering for millions of people. His investigation of working-class conditions in northern England revealed how industrial capitalism treats human beings like machines. His time as a colonial policeman in Burma demonstrated how capitalism depends on the exploitation of weaker peoples. These were not theoretical insights for Orwell. They were based on what he had seen with his own eyes. But Orwell's socialism was fundamentally different from the Marxist socialism that dominated left-wing movements in his era. He had no interest in complex theories about historical materialism or dialectical processes. He did not believe that socialism was historically inevitable or that it would automatically solve all human problems. He was not interested in creating a new form of society based on radical theories about human nature. His socialism was much simpler and more practical. He wanted a society where ordinary people could live decent lives without fear of poverty, exploitation, or oppression. This meant that Orwell's socialism had to be democratic. Any system that concentrated power in the hands of a few people would inevitably become corrupt and oppressive. It did not matter whether those people called themselves capitalists, fascists, or communists. Power corrupts regardless of the ideology used to justify it. The only way to prevent this corruption was to ensure that political and economic decisions were made by the people who would be affected by them. This required genuine democracy, not the fake democracy offered by totalitarian systems. Orwell understood that democracy and socialism were not just compatible but actually necessary for each other. Real democracy was impossible under capitalism because economic inequality translated directly into political inequality. The wealthy could buy political influence, while the poor were excluded from meaningful participation in political decisions. At the same time, socialism was impossible without democracy, because economic planning required the consent and participation of the people being planned for. Any attempt to impose socialism from above would create a new form of tyranny. Democracy and socialism had to develop together, or not at all. This insight put Orwell at odds with most socialist movements of his time. They were willing to accept temporary dictatorships in order to achieve socialist economic arrangements. They believed that the ends justified the means, that a few years of oppression were acceptable if they led to permanent equality. Orwell rejected this logic completely. He understood that temporary dictatorships never remain temporary. Once people gain absolute power, they find reasons to keep it indefinitely. The means determine the ends, not the other way around. A socialist society created through authoritarian methods will remain authoritarian, regardless of its economic arrangements. Orwell's democratic socialism also had to be English. He did not believe in abstract universal principles that could be applied anywhere in the world. Political systems had to grow out of particular cultures and traditions. English socialism would have to respect English values like fair play, individual privacy, and gradual reform. It could not simply copy the Russian model or the German model or any other foreign model. It had to be adapted to English conditions and English character. This did not mean that English socialism was superior to other forms. It simply meant that political systems had to fit the people they were designed to serve. What would democratic socialism actually look like in practice? Orwell never provided detailed blueprints, but he offered some general principles. The major industries would be publicly owned and operated for the benefit of everyone rather than for private profit. Economic planning would be democratic, with workers and consumers participating in decisions about production and distribution. Wealth would be distributed much more equally, though not necessarily with perfect equality. Political freedoms would be expanded rather than restricted. Education would be available to everyone regardless of their family background. The goal would be to create a society where everyone had the opportunity to develop their potential and contribute to the common good. This vision required a revolution, but not the kind of revolution advocated by communist parties. Orwell envisioned a gradual, democratic transformation that would preserve the best elements of English civilization while eliminating its worst injustices. Violence would be minimized, property rights would be respected for smallholders, and individual freedoms would be protected throughout the transition. The revolution would be moral and cultural as much as political and economic. People would have to learn new ways of thinking about their relationships with each other. They would have to develop a sense of solidarity and mutual responsibility that capitalism actively discourages. Orwell knew that this kind of transformation would be difficult and uncertain. There were no guarantees that democratic socialism would work better than capitalism, or that it could avoid the pitfalls that had trapped other socialist experiments. But he believed it was worth attempting because the alternatives were so much worse. Capitalism was producing increasing inequality and instability. Fascism and communism were producing terror and oppression. Democratic socialism offered the only hope for a society that was both prosperous and free. Even if it failed, the attempt would be morally superior to accepting injustice or embracing tyranny. For Orwell, the choice was not between perfect solutions and imperfect ones. It was between hope and despair. Part 5. The Inexorable Logic of Power. George Orwell understood something about power that most political thinkers prefer to ignore. Power is not just a tool that can be used for good or evil, depending on who wields it. Power is a force that transforms anyone who possesses it in fundamental ways. It creates its own logic, its own needs, and its own justifications. No matter how good someone's intentions are when they first acquire power, the power itself will gradually reshape their character and their goals. This is why every revolution eventually betrays its original ideals. Orwell learned this lesson through bitter personal experience during the Spanish Civil War. He went to Spain believing that he was fighting for socialism, democracy, and human freedom. What he found instead was a bewildering array of competing factions, each claiming to represent the true interests of the people. The Communist Party, which had the most power among the leftist groups, spent as much time attacking other socialists as they did fighting the fascists. They arrested, tortured, and murdered people who had been their allies just weeks earlier. They justified these actions by claiming that unity was essential for victory. But Orwell realized that something deeper was happening. The Communist Party was not simply making tactical mistakes or responding to emergency conditions. They were following the internal logic of power itself. Once they had gained a dominant position among the leftist factions, they had to eliminate any threats to that dominance. Other socialist groups became threats simply by existing as independent organizations. Their different ideas about strategy and tactics became evidence of disloyalty or counter-revolutionary thinking. The party could not tolerate any source of authority other than itself. This was not a choice that evil people made. It was a structural requirement of maintaining power in a competitive environment. Any organization that failed to eliminate its rivals would eventually be eliminated by them. This insight shaped everything Orwell wrote about politics for the rest of his life. He came to understand that political systems are not simply neutral mechanisms for implementing policies. They are dynamic processes that create their own imperatives and incentives. Democratic systems encourage certain kinds of behavior while discouraging others. Authoritarian systems create different incentives that push people toward different kinds of behavior. But all systems that concentrate power in the hands of a few people will eventually produce similar results regardless of the ideologies or personalities involved. Consider how this works in practice. When a small group of people gains control over a society, they immediately face several practical problems. They need to maintain their power against potential rivals. They need to extract resources from the population to fund their activities. They need to prevent organized resistance from developing. They need to maintain the loyalty of their supporters and subordinates. Each of these problems pushes them towards similar solutions regardless of their original intentions. They develop secret police forces to monitor potential threats. They create propaganda systems to control information and opinion. They establish networks of informants to watch the population. They use violence and intimidation to discourage opposition. They distribute rewards and punishments to maintain loyalty within their own ranks. None of these measures may have been part of their original plan. The revolutionaries who overthrew the Russian Tsar probably did not intend to create a system more oppressive than the one they replaced. But each step in the consolidation of power makes the next step inevitable. Once you have secret police, you need to give them targets to justify their existence. Once you have identified enemies, you need to treat them as enemies. Once you have begun using violence, you cannot stop without appearing weak. The logic of power takes over and drives the system forward regardless of what anyone wants. The people in charge become prisoners of the institutions they have created. Orwell saw this process repeated in every authoritarian system he studied. The Nazis did not start with plans for mass murder, but the logic of their racial ideology led them step by step toward genocide. The Soviet communists did not initially plan to starve millions of peasants, but their commitment to rapid industrialization made mass starvation an acceptable cost. In each case, the system itself generated pressures that pushed its leaders toward increasingly extreme measures. The alternatives were always presented as weakness, compromise, or betrayal of the cause. Only the most ruthless actions were seen as truly loyal and revolutionary. This is why Orwell placed such emphasis on limiting and distributing power rather than simply putting it in the hands of good people. Good people become bad people when they acquire too much power. The only way to prevent this transformation is to ensure that no individual or group can accumulate enough power to dominate everyone else. This requires institutional safeguards, not just moral education. It requires systems of checks and balances that operate automatically regardless of the character of the people involved. It requires transparency, accountability, and regular opportunities for the powerless to replace the powerful. But Orwell also understood that these safeguards are inherently fragile. Those who have power always have strong incentives to bypass or eliminate the restrictions placed upon them. They will argue that emergencies require extraordinary measures. They will claim that their opponents are not playing by the rules and therefore do not deserve protection. They will insist that efficiency demands centralization and that consultation leads to paralysis. Each argument sounds reasonable in isolation, but together they lead inevitably towards authoritarianism. The only real defense against this process is constant vigilance by ordinary citizens. People must be willing to defend institutional safeguards even when doing so seems to prevent good policies from being implemented. They must resist the temptation to grant emergency powers even to leaders they trust. They must insist on transparency and accountability even when secrecy seems more efficient. Most importantly, they must remember that power corrupts even the most well-intentioned people. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not just against external enemies, but against the inevitable tendency of power to corrupt those who possess it. Part 6. True Patriotism versus Destructive Nationalism. George Orwell made one of the most important political distinctions of the 20th century when he separated patriotism from nationalism. Most people use these words interchangeably, but Orwell understood that they represent completely different ways of relating to your country and your fellow citizens. Patriotism comes from love and leads to service. Nationalism comes from insecurity and leads to aggression. Understanding this difference is essential for anyone who wants to participate constructively in political life. It may be the most important insight that Orwell offers to our current political moment. Patriotism, as Orwell defined it, is devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life. The patriot loves his country because he knows it intimately. He appreciates its landscapes, its customs, its achievements, and its character. He understands its flaws and limitations, but he also sees its potential for improvement. His love is specific and concrete rather than abstract and ideological. He wants his country to be the best version of itself, not necessarily better than every other country in the world. The patriot's love is defensive rather than aggressive. He wants to protect what is valuable in his country's traditions and institutions. He doesn't feel any need to force his way of life on other peoples. He recognizes that other countries have their own traditions and institutions that work for them. His patriotism makes him a better neighbor, not a more dangerous enemy. He can appreciate what is good in other cultures without feeling threatened by their differences. Nationalism operates according to completely different principles. The nationalist does not love his country so much as he loves the idea of his country's superiority over other countries. His attachment is competitive rather than appreciative. His country must be the best in everything, or else his identity is threatened. He cannot simply enjoy his country's achievements. Those achievements only matter if they prove that his country is superior to rival countries. This competitive mindset poisons the nationalist's relationship with reality. He becomes unable to acknowledge any flaws or failures in his country because doing so would undermine his sense of superiority. He also becomes unable to recognize any achievements or virtues in other countries because doing so would threaten his country's claim to superiority. Facts become weapons in a propaganda war rather than information that might guide better policies. The nationalist's judgment becomes systematically distorted by his need to prove that his side is always right. He loses the capacity for honest evaluation that is essential for political progress. Orwell observed that nationalism often manifests itself in obsession with symbols rather than substances. The nationalist cares intensely about flag displays, anthem protocols, and ceremonial precedents. He becomes outraged when his country's symbols are not treated with sufficient respect. But he may be completely indifferent to whether his country's policies are actually serving its citizens well. The appearance of respect matters more than the reality of effective governance. This symbolic focus allows politicians to distract nationalists from their policy failures by manipulating their emotional responses to ritual and ceremony. Nationalism also creates what Orwell called transferred nationalism. Many intellectuals cannot sustain intense emotional attachment to their own countries because they know too much about their flaws and contradictions. but they still need the psychological satisfaction that comes from identifying with a powerful cause. So they transfer their nationalist emotions to foreign countries or abstract movements that seem more pure and heroic than their own societies. Communist intellectuals in the West worshipped Stalin's Soviet Union. Conservative intellectuals idealized imaginary versions of past civilizations. In each case, distance made idealization easier by obscuring inconvenient facts. The transferred nationalist could maintain his faith because he never had to live with the reality of the system he admired. Orwell also identified negative nationalism, which defines itself primarily through hatred of some other group rather than love of one's own group. Anti-Semitism is a form of negative nationalism that has nothing to do with any positive vision of society. Anti-Americanism serves the same function for some European intellectuals. These negative nationalisms provide emotional satisfaction without requiring any constructive program or realistic assessment of alternatives. They allow people to feel morally superior without taking responsibility for improving anything. They channel frustration and resentment into hatred rather than into productive action. The psychological appeal of nationalism is understandable. It provides a sense of identity and belonging that many people desperately need. It offers simple answers to complex questions about political loyalty and moral obligation. It creates clear distinctions between friends and enemies in a confusing world. It allows ordinary people to participate vicariously in great historical events and achievements. For many people, nationalism fills a spiritual void left by the decline of traditional religion. But Orwell insisted that these psychological benefits come at too high a cost. Nationalism makes rational political discussion almost impossible because nationalists cannot acknowledge facts that contradict their emotional commitments. It leads to policies based on prestige and competition rather than practical human needs. It creates international conflicts that serve no real purpose except to satisfy the psychological needs of nationalists. Most dangerously, it makes people willing to sacrifice their own freedom and welfare for abstract goals like national glory or ideological purity. The nationalist loses his individual identity in the collective identity of his chosen group. Orwell believed that patriotism offered a healthier alternative to nationalism. The patriot maintains his individual judgment while caring deeply about his community. He can love his country without hating other countries. He can work for improvement without denying current problems. He can appreciate his traditions without becoming enslaved to them. His love is mature and realistic rather than infantile and idealistic. This distinction between patriotism and nationalism is especially important in democratic societies. Democracy requires citizens who can think independently about political questions while still caring enough about their communities to participate in public life. Patriots make good democratic citizens because they combine emotional attachment with rational judgment. Nationalists make dangerous democratic citizens because their emotional attachments override their rational judgment. A democracy full of nationalists will eventually cease to be democratic. It will become a system where competing groups fight for the power to impose their vision on everyone else. Part 7. Class, Status and Human Dignity. George Orwell understood class in a way that most political theorists never have. He did not approach it as an abstract sociological category or an economic relationship. For Orwell, class was about human dignity. It was about the daily humiliations and small cruelties that some people inflict on others simply because they can. It was about the psychological damage that inequality creates in both the oppressed and the oppressors. Most importantly, it was about the barriers that prevent human beings from relating to each other as equals. Orwell learned about class through direct experience rather than through books. Born into what he called the lower upper middle class, he occupied an uncomfortable position in the English social hierarchy. His family had social pretensions but little money to support them. They looked down on people below them while being looked down upon by people above them. This gave Orwell an inside view of how class consciousness operates at every level of society. He saw how it shapes people's assumptions about themselves and others. But Orwell's real education about class came when he deliberately descended the social ladder. After resigning from the Imperial Police in Burma, he spent months living among the poorest people in Paris and London. He worked as a dishwasher in expensive restaurants, where he watched wealthy customers treat working people like servants rather than human beings. He slept in homeless shelters, where he observed the elaborate rules and hierarchies that develop even among people who own nothing. He discovered that class differences are not just about money. They are about fundamental assumptions about human worth and dignity. What shocked Orwell most was how completely the class system deformed the personalities of everyone involved in it. Working-class people developed habits of deference and submission that made them unable to assert their own interests effectively. They internalized the belief that they deserved their inferior position because they were inherently less capable or worthy than their social superiors. This psychological damage was often more destructive than the material deprivation they suffered. It prevented them from recognizing that their situation was unjust and changeable rather than natural and inevitable. They became complicit in their own oppression. But the upper classes were damaged too, though in different ways. They developed habits of arrogance and entitlement that made them insensitive to the suffering of others. They convinced themselves that their privileges were earned rather than inherited. They created elaborate justifications for inequality that allowed them to feel virtuous while perpetuating injustice. Most dangerously, they lost the capacity for genuine human relationships across class lines. They could not see working-class people as individuals with their own thoughts, feelings and aspirations. Orwell observed these dynamics most clearly during his investigation of working-class conditions in northern England. He was struck by the dignity and intelligence of the coal miners and factory workers he met. They understood their situation clearly and had developed sophisticated strategies for surviving under difficult conditions. But they had also learned to hide their real thoughts and feelings from middle-class observers like himself. They knew that expressing anger or resentment about their treatment would be seen as evidence of their unfitness for better positions. They had to perform gratitude and contentment even when they felt neither. The middle classes, meanwhile, had developed what Orwell called an extraordinary ability to avoid seeing what was right in front of them. They could drive through industrial districts without noticing the poverty and pollution. They could employ domestic servants without thinking about the conditions those servants lived in when they went home. They could support imperial policies without considering the human cost of maintaining the empire. This willful blindness was not simply selfishness. It was a psychological defense mechanism that allowed them to maintain their self-image as decent people while participating in an indecent system. Orwell understood that class distinctions are maintained through countless small rituals and assumptions rather than through formal rules or legal barriers. The way people dress, speak, eat and carry themselves immediately identifies their social position to others. These markers are learned so early and practiced so constantly that they become unconscious. People from different classes literally inhabit different worlds even when they occupy the same physical spaces. They have different vocabularies, different assumptions about appropriate behavior, and different expectations about how they should be treated by others. These differences make genuine communication across class lines extremely difficult. But Orwell also discovered that class barriers could be temporarily overcome under certain circumstances. During his time fighting in the Spanish Civil War, he experienced brief moments of genuine equality with people from very different backgrounds. When everyone was facing the same dangers and hardships, the normal markers of social status became irrelevant. People related to each other as individuals rather than as representatives of their social classes. This experience convinced Orwell that class distinctions were artificial rather than natural. They could be eliminated if the underlying conditions that created them were changed. This is why Orwell's socialism was fundamentally about human relationships rather than just economic arrangements. He wanted to create a society where people could relate to each other as equals regardless of their occupations or backgrounds. This required more than just redistributing wealth or changing ownership structures. It required transforming the culture and psychology of class that had been built up over centuries. People would have to learn new ways of thinking about themselves and others. They would have to develop new habits of mutual respect and recognition. Orwell knew that this transformation would be difficult and gradual. Class consciousness is deeply embedded in language, education, family traditions and social institutions. Simply declaring everyone equal would not eliminate the psychological patterns that had been shaped by generations of inequality. Real change would require deliberate effort to create new institutions and practices that encourage egalitarian relationships. It would also require constant vigilance against the tendency for new forms of hierarchy and status to emerge. The goal was not to eliminate all differences between people, but to ensure that those differences did not translate into differences in dignity or worth. Part 8. The individual against the collective. Perhaps the most profound aspect of George Orwell's philosophy was his understanding of the relationship between individual consciousness and collective power. He came to believe that the ultimate battleground for human freedom was not in parliaments or on military fields. It was in what he called the few cubic centimetres inside each person's skull. This is where the most important decisions about freedom and tyranny are made. This is where individuals either maintain their capacity for independent thought or surrender it to collective authority. Everything else depends on the outcome of this internal struggle. Orwell reached this conclusion through bitter experience with collective movements. He had joined the fight against fascism in Spain, believing that collective action was necessary to defend individual freedom. What he discovered instead was that collective movements, even those with admirable goals, tend to suppress individual judgment in favour of group loyalty. Members are expected to accept the leadership's interpretation of events rather than forming their own opinions based on their own observations. Questioning the party line becomes evidence of disloyalty or counter-revolutionary thinking. Gradually, people lose the habit of thinking for themselves. This process is not necessarily imposed from above by manipulative leaders. Often it emerges naturally from the psychological dynamics of group membership. People want to belong, to feel that they are part of something larger and more important than themselves. They derive emotional satisfaction from sharing beliefs and goals with others who seem to understand them. But this emotional satisfaction comes at the cost of intellectual independence. The more deeply people identify with a group, the harder it becomes for them to acknowledge facts that might reflect badly on that group. Orwell observed this dynamic in every political movement he encountered. Conservatives refused to acknowledge the failures of capitalism or the injustices of imperialism. Socialists refused to acknowledge the crimes of Stalin or the contradictions in Marxist theory. Pacifists refused to acknowledge that their position depended on others being willing to use violence on their behalf. Each group developed elaborate psychological defenses against information that challenged their fundamental assumptions. They became incapable of learning from experience because they could not admit that their experiences contradicted their beliefs. The ultimate expression of this tendency is what Orwell called doublethink. This is the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously without recognizing the contradiction. The party member in 1984 can believe that Big Brother is all-powerful and also believe that Big Brother is constantly threatened by enemies. He can believe that the party never makes mistakes and also believe that the party is constantly correcting its previous mistakes. These contradictions do not create psychological discomfort because each belief is activated only when it is useful and suppressed when it might conflict with other beliefs. The mind becomes compartmentalized so that different sections never communicate with each other. But Orwell understood that doublethink was not just a feature of totalitarian societies. It exists in milder forms in all societies where people's psychological needs conflict with objective reality. Democratic politicians routinely promise things they know they cannot deliver because voters want to believe those promises. Consumers buy products they know they do not need because advertising creates artificial desires. Citizens support policies that harm their own interests because those policies serve their psychological need to feel superior to other groups. In each case, people choose comfortable illusions over uncomfortable truths. The antidote to doublethink is what Orwell called common sense. This is not sophisticated philosophical reasoning or scientific analysis. It is the simple capacity to observe reality accurately and to remember what you have observed. Common sense tells you that stones are hard, water is wet, and objects fall toward the earth when dropped. It tells you that contradictory statements cannot both be true. It tells you that your own experience is more reliable than official propaganda. Most importantly, it tells you that 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of what anyone else says. These simple truths provide a foundation that no amount of sophisticated reasoning can shake. But maintaining common sense requires constant effort in a world full of people who want to manipulate your thinking. You must be willing to trust your own observations, even when they contradict popular opinion. You must be willing to change your mind when new evidence contradicts your previous beliefs. You must be willing to admit ignorance rather than pretending to understand things you do not understand. Most importantly, you must be willing to think for yourself rather than accepting the thoughts of others. This kind of intellectual independence is lonely and difficult, but it is the only real defense against manipulation. Orwell knew that very few people would be willing or able to maintain this level of intellectual independence. Most people prefer the comfort and security of belonging to a group that tells them what to think. They would rather be wrong together than right alone. But Orwell believed that even a small number of independent thinkers could make a crucial difference. They could serve as witnesses to reality when everyone else was caught up in collective delusions. They could preserve the memory of facts that others wanted to forget. They could maintain the standards of truth and rationality that make genuine political discussion possible. In the darkest times, they could keep alive the possibility that things might be different. This is why Orwell placed such emphasis on the individual's responsibility to resist collective pressure. It is not enough to have good political institutions if the people within those institutions lack the courage and independence to use them properly. Democracy depends on citizens who can think critically about the choices they are offered. Science depends on researchers who will follow evidence wherever it leads. Journalism depends on reporters who will tell the truth even when it is unpopular. In every area of human activity, progress depends on individuals who are willing to stand against the crowd when the crowd is wrong. But Orwell also understood that individual resistance has its limits. No one can maintain complete independence from the society they live in. Everyone's thinking is shaped by their culture, their education, and their social relationships. The goal is not to achieve perfect objectivity, but to maintain enough independence to function as a rational human being. This requires finding the right balance between social belonging and intellectual autonomy. It requires participating in collective life without surrendering your individual judgment. This balance is difficult to achieve and easy to lose, but it is essential for any society that wants to remain both free and functional. Part 9. Empire, Imperialism and the Psychology of Domination. George Orwell's understanding of imperialism was shaped by 5 years of service as a colonial policeman in Burma. This experience gave him an inside view of how imperial systems actually work on the ground level. He saw how they affect not just the colonized peoples, but also the colonizers themselves. He discovered that imperialism corrupts everyone it touches, creating psychological damage that lasts for generations. Most importantly, he learned that imperialism is not primarily about economics or strategy. It is about the human need to feel superior to other human beings. Orwell was only 19 when he arrived in Burma, full of conventional ideas about the civilizing mission of the British Empire. He believed that British rule was bringing order, progress and enlightenment to backward peoples who could not govern themselves effectively. What he found instead was a system based on fear, resentment and mutual misunderstanding. The British maintained control through violence and the constant threat of violence. The Burmese submitted because they had no choice, but they hated their rulers and looked forward to the day when they could drive them out. There was no gratitude, no willing cooperation, and no genuine progress toward any civilized ideal. Even more disturbing to Orwell was the effect that this system had on the British officials who administered it. They were required to maintain an image of confident superiority even when they felt confused and inadequate. They had to make decisions about cultures they did not understand for people whose languages they could not speak. They had to enforce laws that often made no sense in local conditions. They had to pretend to knowledge and wisdom they did not possess. This constant performance of authority gradually corrupted their capacity for honest self-examination. Orwell described this psychological dynamic in his famous essay, Shooting an Elephant. As a police officer, he was called upon to deal with an elephant that had gone on a rampage and killed a local man. By the time he arrived, the elephant was calm and posed no threat to anyone. The rational thing to do would have been to wait for the elephant's owner to reclaim it. But a crowd of Burmese had gathered to watch what the white man would do. They expected him to shoot the elephant because that was what a decisive imperial authority would do. Orwell knew that shooting the elephant was unnecessary and wasteful. But he also knew that failing to shoot it would make him look weak and indecisive. His authority depended on maintaining the image of a man who always knew what to do and never hesitated to do it. So he shot the elephant, not because it was the right thing to do, but because the logic of imperial domination required it. He had become a prisoner of the role he was supposed to play. The system that gave him power over others had taken away his power over himself. This experience taught Orwell that imperialism enslaves the oppressor as well as the oppressed. Imperial officials could not afford to show uncertainty, compassion, or cultural humility, because doing so would undermine the psychological foundations of their authority. They had to perform superiority constantly, even when they knew they were inferior in knowledge, wisdom, or moral standing to the people they ruled. This performance became a psychological burden that warped their personalities and poisoned their relationships with everyone around them. Orwell also observed how imperialism created false consciousness among the colonized peoples. Some of them internalized the imperial ideology and came to believe that British rule really was superior to their own traditional forms of government. They adopted British mannerisms, values and attitudes while developing contempt for their own culture. This psychological colonization was often more destructive than the political and economic exploitation. It created lasting divisions within colonized societies between those who collaborated with the imperial system and those who resisted it. These divisions often persisted long after formal independence was achieved. But Orwell understood that imperialism was not just a historical phenomenon confined to the relationship between European powers and their overseas colonies. The same psychological dynamics could be found in any relationship where one group claimed natural superiority over another group. The way that upper-class English people treated working-class English people resembled the way that white colonizers treated colonized peoples. The same assumptions about natural hierarchy, the same performance of superiority, and the same mutual resentment could be found in domestic class relationships. This insight shaped Orwell's understanding of totalitarian movements like fascism and communism. These movements promised to eliminate traditional forms of oppression while creating new and more intensive forms of imperial domination. Nazi Germany sought to establish a racial empire that would treat Slavic peoples the way that European powers had traditionally treated African and Asian peoples. The Soviet Union created an ideological empire that subjugated other nations in the name of socialist solidarity. In each case, the rhetoric of liberation concealed new forms of imperial psychology. The oppressors convinced themselves that their domination served the interests of the oppressed. Orwell believed that the only way to break this cycle was to reject the psychology of superiority that underlies all forms of imperialism. This required recognizing that no group of people has a natural right to rule over any other group of people. It required acknowledging that cultural differences do not imply cultural hierarchies. It required accepting that political and economic arrangements should serve the needs of the people who live under them rather than the psychological needs of those who impose them. But Orwell knew that overcoming imperial psychology would be extremely difficult. The need to feel superior to others seems to be deeply embedded in human nature. People who have been oppressed often dream not of ending oppression, but of becoming oppressors themselves. Revolutionary movements that begin by fighting against imperial domination often end by creating new forms of imperial domination. The cycle continues because the underlying psychology remains unchanged. Only by understanding this psychology and consciously working to overcome it can societies hope to create genuinely egalitarian relationships between different groups of people. Part 10. The corruption and responsibility of intellectuals. George Orwell had a complex and often hostile relationship with intellectuals. He was one himself, yet he spent much of his career criticizing the intellectual class for its dishonesty, arrogance and disconnection from ordinary human experience. Orwell believed that intellectuals had special responsibilities because of their influence over public opinion and their access to information. When they failed to meet these responsibilities, they caused damage that went far beyond their own personal failures. They corrupted the very foundations of rational public discourse. They made it impossible for democratic societies to make informed decisions about important questions. What disturbed Orwell most about intellectuals was their tendency to become more loyal to abstract ideas than to concrete realities. They would defend theoretical systems even when those systems produced obvious human suffering. They would ignore or rationalize away facts that contradicted their preferred ideologies. They would use their sophisticated reasoning abilities to construct elaborate justifications for beliefs they had adopted for emotional rather than rational reasons. In the process, they abandoned their proper role as seekers and defenders of truth. They became propagandists for whatever cause had captured their imagination. Orwell observed this dynamic most clearly in relation to Soviet communism. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, many Western intellectuals defended Stalin's regime despite overwhelming evidence of its brutality and dishonesty. They excused mass murders as necessary for building socialism. They explained show trials as legitimate responses to counter-revolutionary activity. They dismissed reports of forced labor camps as capitalist propaganda. They did this not because they lacked access to accurate information, but because acknowledging the truth would have undermined their faith in socialist revolution. These intellectuals had transferred their nationalist emotions from their own countries to the Soviet Union. They needed to believe that somewhere in the world a truly just and rational society was being built. This psychological need made them incapable of evaluating Soviet policies objectively. They saw what they wanted to see and ignored everything else. When confronted with undeniable evidence of Soviet crimes, they would argue that these were temporary aberrations or unfortunate necessities. They could not admit that their idealized society was just another form of tyranny. But Orwell understood that intellectual dishonesty was not limited to communist sympathizers. Conservative intellectuals displayed similar patterns when defending capitalism, imperialism, or traditional social hierarchies. They would ignore or minimize the suffering caused by these systems while exaggerating their benefits. They would use sophisticated economic or philosophical arguments to justify arrangements that primarily served their own class interests. They would dismiss critics as naive idealists who did not understand the complexities of real-world governance. In each case, intellectual sophistication became a tool for avoiding honest moral judgment. Orwell believed that this corruption of intellectual life had several causes. First, intellectuals were often economically dependent on institutions that had strong interests in maintaining the status quo. Universities, think tanks, newspapers and publishing houses were controlled by wealthy donors or corporate sponsors who expected intellectual work to support their broader political and economic agendas. Intellectuals who challenged these agendas too directly found themselves marginalized or excluded from mainstream intellectual institutions. Second, intellectuals often lived in social bubbles that isolated them from the consequences of the policies they advocated. They could support radical economic experiments because they would not have to live under the resulting conditions. They could defend imperial policies because they would not have to serve as colonial administrators or face colonized peoples as individuals. They could advocate for wars because they would not have to fight in them. This isolation made it easy for them to treat real human suffering as an acceptable cost of pursuing abstract ideals. They lost touch with the human reality behind their political theories. Third, intellectuals were susceptible to what Orwell called the appeal of power worship. They were attracted to political movements and leaders who seemed to be making history rather than simply responding to it. They wanted to be on the winning side of great historical transformations. This made them willing to excuse the methods used by powerful leaders as long as those leaders seemed to be moving in the right direction. They confused historical significance with moral legitimacy. They forgot that the most historically significant events are often the most morally destructive. Orwell believed that intellectuals could only fulfill their proper social function if they maintained strict intellectual honesty, regardless of the political consequences. This meant being willing to acknowledge facts that contradicted their preferred beliefs. It meant being willing to criticize movements and leaders they had previously supported when those movements and leaders went wrong. It meant being willing to stand alone when necessary rather than going along with popular opinion. Most importantly, it meant remembering that their primary loyalty should be to truth rather than to any political cause or social group. Truth was more important than success, consistency, or belonging. This standard of intellectual honesty was extremely demanding. It required constant self-examination and the willingness to admit mistakes. It required resisting the psychological pressures that push people toward conformity and group loyalty. It required accepting the loneliness and isolation that often comes with independent thinking. Few intellectuals were willing or able to meet this standard consistently, but Orwell believed that even those who failed most of the time could serve a valuable function by occasionally telling important truths that others were afraid to tell. Orwell also believed that intellectuals had a special responsibility to write clearly and honestly about political questions. Their access to education and their skill with language gave them unusual power to shape public opinion. When they used this power to confuse, rather than clarify, they contributed to the degradation of democratic discourse. When they used it to promote their own interests rather than the public interest, they betrayed the trust that society had placed in them. The intellectual who deliberately obscures important truths is more dangerous than the ignorant person who simply does not know those truths. Knowledge creates responsibility, and those who have knowledge must use it wisely. Part 11. Literature, Art, and the Political Imagination. George Orwell believed that literature was inherently political, but not in the way that most people understood politics. He did not think that good literature should promote particular policies or candidates. Instead, he believed that literature shapes the way people think about fundamental questions of human experience. It influences their understanding of what is possible, what is desirable, and what is morally acceptable. In this deeper sense, every serious work of literature is political because it either reinforces or challenges the assumptions that underlie political systems. Writers cannot escape political responsibility by claiming to be purely artistic. But Orwell also insisted that literature could only fulfill its political function if it remained genuinely literary. Propaganda disguised as art was worse than useless because it corrupted both politics and literature without serving either effectively. Good political literature had to work first as literature. It had to create believable characters, compelling situations, and emotionally satisfying resolutions. Readers had to be drawn into the fictional world by its artistic merits before they could be influenced by its political implications. Art that sacrificed aesthetic quality for political message would reach no one except those who already agreed with its politics. This principle guided Orwell's approach to his own political writing. Animal Farm works as political allegory precisely because it works first as a story about farm animals. Readers become emotionally invested in the fate of the horses, pigs and other animals before they fully understand what those animals represent politically. By the time they recognize the political allegory, they have already accepted the story's judgment about the corruption of revolutionary movements. The political message emerges naturally from the artistic structure rather than being imposed artificially upon it. This integration of form and content is what makes the book both good literature and effective political communication. Orwell applied the same principle to 1984. The novel works as political warning because it works first as psychological drama about one man's struggle to maintain his humanity under impossible conditions. Readers identify with Winston Smith's desire for truth, love, and individual dignity. They experience his gradual destruction as a personal tragedy rather than as an abstract political argument. The horror of totalitarianism becomes real because it is embodied in particular human experiences rather than explained through theoretical analysis. The political point is made more powerfully because it is made artistically. But Orwell understood that different literary forms were suited to different political purposes. Satire like Animal Farm was effective for exposing the gap between political ideals and political realities. Dystopian fiction, like 1984, was effective for exploring the logical consequences of current political trends. Realistic documentation like The Road to Wigan Pier was effective for making abstract social problems concrete and personal. Essays like Politics and the English Language were effective for analysing specific techniques of manipulation and control. Each form had its own strengths and limitations for political communication. Orwell also believed that literature had a special responsibility to preserve human values during times of political crisis. When political movements were demanding that everything be subordinated to ideological goals, literature could remind people of the individual human experiences that politics was supposed to serve. When propaganda was simplifying complex realities into crude oppositions between good and evil, literature could explore the contradictions and ambiguities that make human life genuinely interesting. When political language was becoming corrupt and meaningless, literature could demonstrate what clear, honest expression looked like. This preservative function of literature was particularly important during the rise of totalitarian movements in the 20th century. These movements sought to eliminate the private sphere of human experience and make everything public and political. They wanted to control not just people's actions, but their thoughts, feelings and dreams. Literature provided a refuge for the kinds of individual experience that totalitarian systems could not tolerate. It kept alive the memory of what human life was like when people were free to love, think, and feel, without constant surveillance and control. In the darkest political times, literature served as a repository of human values that might otherwise be forgotten. But Orwell warned against the tendency to treat literature as a substitute for political action. Some intellectuals retreated into aesthetic appreciation as a way of avoiding the uncomfortable realities of political life. They convinced themselves that preserving cultural values was more important than fighting against political oppression. This was a form of escapism that ultimately served the interests of those who benefited from the status quo. Literature could support political resistance, but it could not replace it. Writers and readers still had to act as citizens if they wanted to preserve the conditions that made good literature possible. Orwell also recognized that literature could be used for destructive political purposes. Totalitarian regimes produced their own forms of art, designed to glorify the state and demonize its enemies. This literature was technically sophisticated and often emotionally powerful, but it served to narrow rather than expand human understanding. It encouraged readers to surrender their individual judgment to collective authority. It promoted hatred, fear, and mindless obedience rather than love, courage, and independent thought. Good literature had to actively resist these tendencies by celebrating the values that totalitarian art sought to destroy. The political responsibility of literature was therefore both positive and negative. Positively, literature should explore and celebrate the full range of human experience. It should help readers understand themselves and others more deeply. It should expand their capacity for empathy, imagination, and moral judgment. Negatively, literature should resist attempts to reduce human experience to political formulas. It should challenge propaganda, expose lies, and defend the integrity of language itself. It should serve as a constant reminder that individual human beings are more important than any political system designed to govern them. In fulfilling these responsibilities, literature becomes one of the most important forms of political action available to free societies. Part 12. The Failure of Capitalism and the Search for Alternatives. George Orwell's critique of capitalism was not based on abstract economic theory, but on direct observation of how capitalist systems actually affected human beings. He saw capitalism from multiple perspectives during his lifetime. As a colonial policeman in Burma, he witnessed how capitalist enterprises exploited both natural resources and human labor in colonized territories. As an investigator of working-class conditions in northern England, he observed the daily reality of industrial capitalism for ordinary workers. As someone who had experienced poverty himself in Paris and London, he understood how market systems treated people who had no capital to sell except their labor. From each of these vantage points, capitalism appeared as a system that prioritized profit over human welfare. What struck Orwell most about capitalism was its fundamental irrationality. It was a system that could produce abundance and scarcity simultaneously. Factories could manufacture more goods than people could afford to buy, while workers who had made those goods went without basic necessities. Land could lie idle while people were homeless. Food could be destroyed to maintain prices while people were hungry. This was not an accidental byproduct of capitalism, but an inevitable result of its internal logic. When production is organized for profit rather than for use, human needs become secondary to market dynamics. The system serves capital rather than making capital serve human purposes. Orwell also observed how capitalism distorted human relationships. In a market system, everything becomes a commodity that can be bought and sold. Labor becomes a commodity, land becomes a commodity, and eventually human relationships themselves become commodified. People learn to think of themselves and others primarily in terms of their economic value. Success is measured by the ability to accumulate wealth rather than by the ability to contribute to human flourishing. This commodification of human life creates psychological damage that goes far beyond material deprivation. The class system that capitalism creates was particularly disturbing to Orwell. He saw how it divided people into rigid hierarchies based on their relationship to capital rather than on their human qualities. Those who owned capital could live without working, while those who owned only their labour had to sell themselves to survive. This created fundamentally different life experiences and opportunities for different groups of people. More importantly, it created different psychological orientations toward the world. Owners developed habits of domination and entitlement, while workers developed habits of submission and deference. But Orwell's critique of capitalism was complicated by his recognition that it had also produced genuine benefits. Capitalist societies were generally more prosperous than pre-capitalist societies. They offered more opportunities for individual advancement and more protection for individual rights. They encouraged innovation and efficiency in ways that other economic systems often did not. Most importantly, they had created the material conditions that made socialist alternatives possible. Without the productive capacity developed under capitalism, socialism would remain a utopian dream rather than a practical possibility. Orwell also acknowledged that capitalism was not monolithic. Different capitalist societies had developed different ways of managing the tensions between private profit and public welfare. Some had stronger social safety nets, more powerful labour unions and more extensive public services than others. Some had more democratic political systems that allowed working-class people to influence economic policies. These variations suggested that capitalism could be reformed and regulated rather than simply overthrown. The question was whether such reforms could address the fundamental problems of the system or merely ameliorate their worst effects. Orwell's socialism emerged from his conviction that capitalism's problems were structural rather than incidental. As long as production was organized for private profit, human needs would remain subordinate to market forces. As long as some people owned capital, while others owned only their labour, class divisions would persist and intensify. As long as economic decisions were made by those who would profit from them rather than by those who would be affected by them, ordinary people would remain powerless over their own economic fate. These problems could not be solved through reforms that left the basic structure of capitalism intact. They required a fundamental reorganization of economic relationships. But Orwell's alternative to capitalism was not the centralized state socialism practiced in the Soviet Union. He saw that system as a form of state capitalism that concentrated economic power in the hands of government bureaucrats rather than private owners. The workers remained powerless, and the class system remained intact, even though the particular individuals at the top had changed. Real socialism would have to be democratic, with economic decisions made by the people who would be affected by them. It would have to decentralize power rather than concentrate it. It would have to preserve individual freedoms while creating collective ownership. Orwell never provided detailed blueprints for how such a system would work in practice. He was more interested in establishing the principles that should guide any socialist transformation than in working out the specific mechanisms. He believed that different societies would have to develop their own forms of socialism based on their particular circumstances and traditions. What mattered was the commitment to organizing economic life for human welfare rather than private profit. What mattered was ensuring that those who did the work had control over the conditions and purposes of their work. What mattered was creating a society where everyone had the opportunity to develop their potential and contribute to the common good. Orwell understood that this kind of transformation would face enormous resistance from those who benefited from the existing system. It would also face practical difficulties that socialist theorists had not adequately addressed. But he believed that the attempt was necessary because the alternatives were worse. Capitalism was producing increasing inequality and instability that threatened the foundations of democratic society. Fascism and authoritarian communism offered false solutions that led to tyranny and oppression. Democratic socialism was the only path that offered hope for a society that was both prosperous and free. Part 13. Technology, Surveillance and the Future of Privacy. George Orwell understood that technology was not politically neutral. Each new technological development changed the balance of power between individuals and institutions in ways that could either expand or contract human freedom. The same technologies that could liberate people from drudgery and isolation could also be used to monitor and control them more effectively than any previous system of oppression. The crucial question was not whether to develop new technologies, but how to ensure that they served human freedom rather than undermining it. Orwell's most famous exploration of this theme appears in 1984 through the concept of the telescreen. This device functions both as an entertainment system and as a surveillance system. It provides information and diversion to its users while simultaneously monitoring their behavior for signs of disloyalty or nonconformity. The users cannot turn it off and cannot escape its watchful eye. Most disturbing of all, they gradually stop thinking of it as an intrusion and begin to accept constant surveillance as a normal part of daily life. The technology becomes invisible precisely because it becomes ubiquitous. When Orwell wrote 1984, this level of technological surveillance seemed like science fiction. The necessary technologies did not exist, and the cost of implementing them would have been prohibitive. But Orwell understood that technological capabilities tend to expand over time, while their costs tend to decrease. What seems impossible in one generation becomes routine in the next. He was not predicting specific technologies so much as exploring the political implications of technologies that would eventually become available. His purpose was to warn people about dangers they might face before those dangers became unavoidable. Orwell also understood that surveillance technology would be attractive to both authoritarian and democratic governments. Authoritarian governments would use it to maintain control over their populations and eliminate political opposition. Democratic governments would use it to fight crime, prevent terrorism, and improve the efficiency of public services. In both cases, the technology would be justified as serving legitimate public purposes. But the effect would be the same. Individual privacy would be eroded, and the capacity for independent action would be diminished. The gradual nature of this erosion was particularly important to Orwell's analysis. Surveillance systems would not be imposed all at once through dramatic government coups. They would be introduced incrementally, with each new capability justified as a reasonable response to some genuine problem. People would accept each small reduction in privacy as a worthwhile trade-off for increased security or convenience. Only in retrospect would they realize how much of their freedom had been surrendered. By then, the surveillance infrastructure would be so deeply embedded in society that removing it would seem impossible. Orwell was particularly concerned about how surveillance technology would affect the capacity for independent thought. When people know they are being watched, they modify their behavior to conform to what they think the watchers want to see. This self-censorship becomes automatic and unconscious over time. People stop thinking thoughts that might be considered dangerous even when they are alone. The external surveillance system becomes internalized as a form of psychological control. The ultimate goal of the surveillance is not to catch people doing wrong things, but to prevent them from even thinking about doing wrong things. But Orwell also recognized that technology could be used to expand human freedom if it was developed and deployed according to different principles. Communication technologies could enable people to share information and coordinate activities across vast distances. Information technologies could give ordinary people access to knowledge that had previously been monopolized by elites. Production technologies could reduce the amount of human labor required to meet basic needs and create more time for education, creativity, and personal development. The same technological capabilities that could create an oppressive surveillance state could also create unprecedented opportunities for human flourishing. The outcome would depend on the political and economic systems within which the technologies were developed and used. This insight led Orwell to focus on the importance of democratic control over technological development. If new technologies were developed primarily by private corporations seeking profit or by government agencies seeking control, they would likely be designed and deployed in ways that served those particular interests rather than the broader public interest. Democratic societies needed to develop mechanisms for ensuring that technological development was guided by public discussion and democratic decision-making. This required both technical literacy among the general population and political institutions capable of regulating technological development effectively. Orwell understood that achieving democratic control over technology would be extremely difficult. The pace of technological change was accelerating, while democratic institutions were designed for slower, more deliberative decision-making processes. The complexity of new technologies made it hard for non-experts to understand their implications and participate meaningfully in decisions about their development. The global nature of technological development made it difficult for any single democratic society to control how technologies were designed and used. These challenges meant that technological development was likely to outpace democratic oversight, creating facts on the ground that democratic institutions would then have to accept. The window for democratic control was narrow and closing rapidly. Despite these difficulties, Orwell believed that the effort to achieve democratic control over technology was essential for preserving human freedom. The alternative was to allow technological development to proceed according to its own internal logic without regard for its human consequences. This would likely lead to a society where human beings were adapted to serve technological systems rather than technological systems being adapted to serve human beings. People would become appendages to machines rather than masters of machines. Their capacity for independent judgment and autonomous action would atrophy through disuse. They would become more efficient and predictable, but less human in any meaningful sense of that term. The ultimate question that Orwell posed about technology was whether human beings could maintain control over their own creations. Every technology is an extension of human capabilities, but it is also a constraint on human freedom. The challenge is to gain the benefits of technological enhancement while avoiding the costs of technological dependence. This requires constant vigilance and active effort to shape technological development according to human values rather than allowing human values to be shaped by technological imperatives. The stakes of this struggle could not be higher. The future of human freedom may depend on the outcome. Part 14. War, Peace, and the Logic of Perpetual Conflict. George Orwell understood war in a way that most people never do. He had experienced it directly as a soldier in the Spanish Civil War, where he was shot through the throat and nearly killed. But more importantly, he had observed how war functions politically and psychologically in modern societies. He realized that war was not simply a breakdown of normal politics, but had become an essential tool for maintaining political control. In the 20th century, perpetual war had become a way of organizing society and shaping human consciousness. Peace was no longer the normal condition that war interrupted, but rather the abnormal condition that war prevented. This insight is central to the dystopian society depicted in 1984. Oceania is always at war with either Eastasia or Eurasia, but never with both at the same time. The identity of the enemy changes periodically, but the fact of being at war never changes. The population is told that these wars are necessary for their protection and that victory is always just around the corner. But Orwell makes it clear that the wars are not really intended to be won. They are intended to consume the society's surplus production and maintain a state of emergency that justifies authoritarian control. The perpetual war serves several important functions for the totalitarian state. It provides a justification for maintaining a large military and security apparatus that can be used to control the domestic population. It creates a sense of external threat that encourages people to accept restrictions on their freedom and demands for sacrifice. It channels popular frustration and anger toward foreign enemies rather than toward domestic problems. It prevents the development of international cooperation that might threaten the regime's control over information and ideology. Most importantly, it creates a permanent state of emergency that makes normal democratic politics impossible. Orwell had observed these dynamics operating in the real world during the 1930s and 40s. Nazi Germany had used the threat of foreign enemies to justify the elimination of democratic institutions and the persecution of domestic minorities. The Soviet Union had used the threat of capitalist encirclement to justify mass terror and forced industrialization. Even democratic countries like Britain had used wartime emergencies to expand government power and restrict civil liberties. In each case, war or the threat of war had been used to override normal democratic processes and constitutional limitations. What seemed like temporary emergency measures often became permanent features of the political system. But Orwell also understood that the psychology of war was changing in fundamental ways. Traditional wars had been fought between clearly defined nation-states for specific territorial or economic objectives. When those objectives were achieved, or when the costs became too high, the wars ended and normal relations were restored. Modern ideological wars were different because they were fought for universal principles rather than specific objectives. When you are fighting for democracy against fascism or for socialism against capitalism, compromise becomes impossible, and victory requires the complete destruction of the enemy's way of life. These wars cannot end through negotiation because the fundamental beliefs of the opposing sides are incompatible. This shift toward ideological warfare had profound implications for the possibility of peace. In traditional conflicts, former enemies could become allies when their interests changed. In ideological conflicts, former enemies remained enemies forever because their basic values remained incompatible. The world became divided into permanent camps that could never achieve lasting reconciliation. Each side had to remain constantly prepared for the final battle that would determine the future of human civilization. Peace became not a goal to be achieved, but a dangerous illusion that weakened the will to fight. Orwell also observed how war affected the internal structure of societies. Countries that were constantly preparing for or fighting wars developed militaristic cultures that valued obedience, hierarchy and collective sacrifice over individual freedom and personal fulfillment. Military values and military methods spread from the armed forces into civilian institutions. Schools began to resemble military training camps, factories began to resemble military units, and political parties began to resemble military organizations. The entire society became mobilized for conflict in ways that left little room for the peacetime activities that had traditionally defined civilized life. Art, literature, philosophy, and science were all subordinated to military needs. The economic effects of perpetual war were equally destructive. Enormous resources that could have been used to improve human welfare were instead devoted to producing weapons that would either be used to destroy human life or become obsolete and need to be replaced. The most talented scientists and engineers were assigned to military research rather than to projects that might benefit ordinary people. Innovation was directed toward more efficient methods of destruction rather than toward more efficient methods of production. The war economy created artificial scarcity even in the midst of potential abundance. People were told they had to accept lower living standards in order to support the war effort. But perhaps the most destructive effect of perpetual war was its impact on human psychology. People who lived under constant threat of violence developed habits of fear, suspicion, and aggression that poisoned their relationships with each other. They learned to see the world in terms of absolute conflicts between good and evil, rather than in terms of complex problems that required nuanced solutions. They became incapable of empathy for people who were defined as enemies. They lost the capacity for the kind of rational discussion and compromise that democratic societies require. War psychology made democratic politics impossible even when formal democratic institutions remained in place. Orwell believed that breaking out of this cycle of perpetual conflict would require a fundamental change in how people thought about politics and international relations. They would have to reject the ideological thinking that divided the world into irreconcilable camps. They would have to accept that different societies could organize themselves according to different principles without necessarily threatening each other. They would have to develop international institutions capable of resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than force. Most importantly, they would have to value peace and human welfare more than they valued victory and national prestige. This would require a revolution in consciousness that would be more difficult to achieve than any political or economic revolution. Part 15. Spain, the Crucible of Orwell's Political Awakening. The Spanish Civil War was the single most important experience in George Orwell's intellectual development. It transformed him from a detached observer of political events into a committed participant in the struggle between freedom and tyranny. More importantly, it taught him lessons about the nature of political movements that shaped everything he wrote for the rest of his life. Spain showed him how revolutionary ideals could be betrayed by those who claimed to represent them. It revealed the gap between political rhetoric and political reality. It demonstrated how easily the fight against one form of tyranny could become the foundation for a new form of tyranny. Orwell went to Spain in December 1936 with relatively simple political ideas. He believed that fascism was evil and that socialism was good. He thought that the Spanish Republic represented democracy and progress, while Franco's rebellion represented reaction and oppression. He expected to find a united left-wing movement fighting heroically against the forces of darkness. What he found instead was a bewildering maze of competing factions, each claiming to represent the true interests of the Spanish people. The left was divided against itself in ways that often seemed more bitter and destructive than its conflicts with the right. The organization that Orwell joined, the PUM, was a small Marxist group that opposed both fascism and Stalinism. They believed in workers' revolution but rejected the centralized control that the Communist Party wanted to impose on the Republican movement. This put them in conflict not only with Franco's fascists, but also with the Soviet-backed communists who were providing crucial support to the Republic. Orwell initially saw these internal conflicts as unfortunate distractions from the main fight against fascism. He thought that people who shared the same basic goals should be able to work together despite their tactical disagreements. He was naive about how deep these disagreements really were. The education that Orwell received in Spain was brutal and rapid. He watched the Communist Party systematically eliminate other left-wing groups through arrests, show trials and assassinations. He saw how they used their control over Soviet weapons and supplies to force other Republican factions to accept their political dominance. He observed how they rewrote history in real time, denying events that he had witnessed personally and inventing events that had never occurred. Most shocking of all, he realized that the communists were more interested in establishing their own power than in defeating fascism. They were willing to weaken the Republican cause if doing so strengthened their position within the Republican movement. This experience taught Orwell several crucial lessons that influenced all of his later political thinking. First, he learned that political movements are never as pure or unified as their propaganda suggests. Every movement contains competing factions with different goals and methods. The faction that eventually gains control may be very different from the movement's original ideals and intentions. People who join political movements thinking they are fighting for one thing may find themselves being used to fight for something entirely different. Good intentions at the beginning provide no guarantee of good results at the end. Second, Orwell learned that the means used to achieve political goals tend to shape those goals in fundamental ways. The Communist Party justified its authoritarian methods by arguing that unity was essential for victory against fascism. But the methods they used to achieve unity were identical to the methods used by fascist movements. They relied on secret police, show trials, propaganda and terror to maintain control. By adopting fascist methods, they began to create fascist results, even though they claimed to be fighting against fascism. The means had corrupted the ends beyond recognition. Third, Orwell learned that political movements tend to attract people who are more interested in power than in the ostensible goals of the movement. The Communist Party leadership in Spain included many people who seemed to enjoy the process of eliminating their enemies more than they cared about defending the Republic. They used the revolutionary situation as an opportunity to settle personal scores and advance their own careers. The idealistic rhetoric about workers' liberation provided a convenient cover for ordinary ambition and cruelty. Revolution attracted both saints and psychopaths, and the psychopaths often proved more effective at gaining control. This was not an accident, but a structural feature of revolutionary situations. Fourth, Orwell learned how easily the press could be manipulated to support false narratives about political events. Newspapers throughout Europe reported the communist version of events in Spain without any independent verification. Journalists who had never been to Spain wrote confidently about battles they had not witnessed and political developments they did not understand. They repeated official propaganda as if it were factual reporting. Even more disturbing, many of them seemed to know they were spreading falsehoods, but did so anyway because the falsehoods served their political purposes. Truth became subordinate to propaganda in ways that made informed public discussion impossible. Finally, Orwell learned that ordinary people often showed more decency and wisdom than their political leaders. The Spanish workers and peasants he met were capable of remarkable courage and solidarity when they were fighting for their immediate interests. They understood their situation clearly and knew what they needed to improve their lives. But they were constantly betrayed by intellectuals and professional revolutionaries who claimed to represent their interests while actually pursuing their own agendas. The problem was not with the people who needed change, but with the political movements that claimed to be working for change. Revolution from below was constructive, while revolution from above was destructive. These lessons from Spain influenced every aspect of Orwell's later work. They explain his suspicion of all political movements, including those he sympathized with. They explain his emphasis on truth-telling as a political responsibility. They explain his concern with the corruption of language and the manipulation of information. They explain his focus on the psychology of power and the tendency of revolutionaries to become what they originally opposed. Most importantly, they explain his belief that preserving individual freedom and independent thought was more important than achieving any particular political outcome. Spain taught Orwell that political progress could not be achieved through revolutionary shortcuts or utopian schemes. It required patient work to build institutions that could resist corruption and protect individual rights. It required constant vigilance against the tendency of all political movements to betray their original principles. It required skepticism toward grand ideological claims and attention to concrete human consequences. Most importantly, it required individuals who were willing to tell the truth about what they had seen, regardless of whether that truth was politically convenient. Without such individuals, all political movements would eventually degenerate into new forms of oppression. Part 16. Memory, History, and the Control of the Past. George Orwell understood that whoever controls the past controls the future, and whoever controls the present controls the past. This insight, articulated through the party slogan in 1984, represents one of his most profound observations about the nature of political power. History is not simply a record of what happened in previous times. It is a tool that shapes how people understand themselves, their society, and their possibilities for the future. Those who can manipulate historical memory can manipulate present consciousness in ways that make alternative futures literally unthinkable. The battle for political freedom is therefore fundamentally a battle for historical truth. Orwell learned this lesson through direct observation of how different political movements treated historical facts. During the Spanish Civil War, he watched communist propagandists rewrite the history of battles that had occurred just weeks or days earlier. Events that he had witnessed personally were denied, minimized, or completely reimagined to serve current political needs. Heroes became traitors, and traitors became heroes depending on the shifting requirements of party loyalty. The past became as fluid and changeable as the present. What mattered was not what had actually happened, but what version of events best served the party's current strategy. This manipulation of historical memory was not simply a matter of lying about specific events. It involved a systematic effort to destroy the mental categories that people use to understand historical processes. If the party could convince people that contradictory statements were both true, then the very concept of historical accuracy would become meaningless. If people could be made to believe that the party had always been right about everything, then the possibility of learning from past mistakes would disappear. If the distinction between past and present could be blurred, then the idea of progress toward a better future would become incomprehensible. Historical manipulation was a form of mental destruction that went far beyond ordinary propaganda. In 1984, Orwell pushed this process to its logical extreme through the character of Winston Smith, whose job is to alter historical records to match the party's current needs. When the party changes its alliance from one foreign power to another, Winston must go through all existing documents and modify them to show that the party has always been allied with its current partner. When production figures fall short of targets, he must adjust previous predictions to make current results appear successful. When party members fall out of favour, he must remove them from historical records as if they had never existed. The past becomes completely malleable, constantly reshaped to serve present purposes. Nothing that happened before this moment has any independent reality. But Orwell understood that this kind of historical manipulation was not limited to totalitarian societies. All governments and political movements engage in some degree of historical revisionism to justify their current policies and enhance their legitimacy. Democratic societies are not immune to the temptation to sanitize their past, glorify their achievements, and minimize their failures. The difference is one of degree rather than kind. Totalitarian societies seek to control historical memory completely, while democratic societies merely seek to influence it. But the underlying dynamic is similar in both cases. What makes historical manipulation so dangerous is that most people have no direct access to the events being described. They must rely on records, documents, and testimonies created by others. If those sources are systematically corrupted, people have no way of knowing what really happened in the past. They become dependent on official authorities to tell them their own history. This dependence makes them vulnerable to manipulation in ways that go far beyond their immediate political choices. It affects their understanding of what is possible, what is normal, and what is desirable in human affairs. Orwell observed this process operating at both individual and collective levels. Individuals often reconstruct their personal memories to fit their current self-image and political commitments. They remember supporting policies they actually opposed and forget supporting policies they now reject. They exaggerate their past prescience and minimize their past mistakes. This psychological tendency makes them complicit in their own manipulation. They want to believe versions of the past that make them feel good about themselves in the present. Collective memory operates according to similar principles, but with more dangerous consequences. Nations routinely teach sanitized versions of their history that emphasize heroic achievements while downplaying shameful episodes. They create founding myths that justify current power arrangements and obscure the conflicts and compromises that actually shaped their development. They transform complex historical figures into simple symbols that can be used to promote contemporary political agendas. This mythologized history serves important psychological and political functions, but it also prevents societies from learning from their actual experiences. They repeat mistakes because they have forgotten or denied that those mistakes ever occurred. The preservation of accurate historical memory therefore becomes a crucial political responsibility. Someone must be willing to remember and record what actually happened, even when doing so is politically inconvenient or personally dangerous. This requires institutional protections for historians, journalists, and other keepers of collective memory. It requires educational systems that teach people to think critically about historical sources and claims. It requires legal and cultural protections for archives, documents, and other forms of historical evidence. Most importantly, it requires individuals who value truth more than comfort, and who are willing to defend unpopular facts against popular fictions. But Orwell also understood that historical memory could never be completely objective or politically neutral. All history is written from particular perspectives and serves particular purposes. The selection of which events to record and how to interpret them necessarily involves value judgments that reflect the historian's political and moral commitments. Perfect objectivity is impossible and probably undesirable. The goal is not to eliminate all bias from historical accounts, but to ensure that multiple perspectives are preserved, and that no single version of events gains a monopoly over collective memory. Diversity of historical interpretation serves as a protection against totalitarian manipulation of the past. This insight led Orwell to emphasize the importance of individual memory as a form of political resistance. In 1984, Winston's ability to remember that 2 + 2 = 4 represents more than mathematical knowledge. It represents his capacity to maintain an independent relationship with reality that the party cannot completely control. His memories of his personal past, fragmentary and uncertain as they are, provide an alternative source of truth that challenges the party's official narratives. The preservation of individual memory becomes a form of political action that requires no organization, no resources, and no permission from authorities. It is the most basic and perhaps most important form of resistance available to people living under oppressive conditions. Part 17. Education, Knowledge and the Shaping of Consciousness. George Orwell believed that education was the most powerful tool for either liberation or repression available to any society. How a society teaches its young people to think determines what kind of adults they will become and what kind of future they will create. Education can develop the capacity for independent thought, critical analysis, and moral judgment that democratic citizenship requires. But it can also create habits of obedience, conformity, and intellectual passivity that make people easy to manipulate and control. The difference between education and indoctrination is often subtle, but its consequences are enormous. Societies that get education wrong will eventually lose their freedom regardless of their political institutions. Orwell's own educational experience at Eton College gave him insights into how elite institutions shape the consciousness of future leaders. Eton was designed to produce confident, articulate men who would naturally assume positions of authority in British society. The school achieved this goal not primarily through academic instruction, but through a complex system of traditions, rituals and social hierarchies that taught students to see themselves as naturally superior to others. They learned to command obedience without questioning whether their commands were wise or just. They developed the psychological habits of rulers long before they had acquired the knowledge or wisdom that rulership requires. This mismatch between confidence and competence had devastating consequences for British society and its empire. But Orwell was equally critical of the education provided to working-class children. These schools were designed to produce obedient workers rather than independent thinkers. They emphasized rote memorization over critical analysis, conformity over creativity, and acceptance over questioning. Students learned to follow instructions without understanding their purpose or questioning their wisdom. They were taught that their role in life was to implement the decisions made by others rather than to participate in making those decisions themselves. This educational approach created a population that was technically competent but politically passive. The content of education was as important as its methods. What students learned about history, literature, science, and politics shaped their understanding of human possibilities and limitations. If they were taught that current social arrangements were natural and inevitable, they would never imagine that those arrangements could be changed. If they were taught that human nature was fundamentally selfish and aggressive, they would never believe that cooperation and altruism were possible. If they were taught that complex problems had simple solutions, they would be vulnerable to demagogues who promised easy answers to difficult questions. The curriculum was therefore a form of political programming that operated below the level of conscious awareness. Orwell observed how totalitarian movements used educational systems to create the kind of citizens they needed. Nazi Germany reorganized its schools to emphasize racial ideology, military discipline, and unquestioning loyalty to the state. Students learned to value collective identity over individual judgment, and to subordinate their personal interests to the needs of the nation. They were taught that critical thinking was a form of disloyalty, and that questioning authority was a sign of weakness. The educational system became a factory for producing fanatics who would implement the regime's policies without moral qualms or intellectual reservations. Similar processes were occurring in the Soviet Union and other authoritarian societies. But Orwell understood that democratic societies faced their own educational challenges. Democracy requires citizens who can think independently about complex political questions and make informed judgments about competing policy proposals. This kind of education is much more difficult to provide than the simple indoctrination used by authoritarian systems. It requires teachers who are themselves capable of independent thought and who are willing to encourage questioning even when that questioning challenges their own beliefs. It requires educational institutions that are insulated from political pressure and commercial influence. It requires a society that values intellectual freedom more than ideological conformity. The development of critical thinking skills was particularly important to Orwell's educational philosophy. Students needed to learn how to evaluate evidence, identify logical fallacies, and recognize propaganda techniques. They needed to understand how language could be used to manipulate thought and how statistics could be used to support false conclusions. They needed to develop the intellectual courage to question popular beliefs and powerful authorities. Most importantly, they needed to learn how to change their minds when new evidence contradicted their previous beliefs. This kind of intellectual flexibility was essential for both personal growth and social progress. But Orwell also believed that education should develop moral as well as intellectual capacities. Students needed to learn empathy, compassion, and a sense of responsibility for the welfare of others. They needed to understand that their actions had consequences that extended beyond their immediate personal interests. They needed to develop the courage to act on their moral convictions, even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. Technical knowledge without moral wisdom would create competent barbarians rather than civilized human beings. The goal of education was to develop the whole person, not just the rational intellect. The role of literature and the arts in education was particularly important to Orwell. These subjects taught students about the full range of human experience and helped them develop their imaginative and emotional capacities. Literature exposed students to different ways of thinking and feeling that broadened their understanding of human possibilities. Art taught them to appreciate beauty and to express their own creativity. These subjects were often dismissed as impractical or irrelevant, but Orwell believed they were essential for developing fully human beings. A society that neglected the arts in favour of purely technical education would produce people who were efficient but spiritually impoverished. Orwell understood that educational reform would be difficult to achieve because existing educational systems served the interests of those who benefited from current social arrangements. Elite schools would resist changes that might threaten their graduates' advantages. Working-class schools would resist changes that might make their students more difficult to control. Political authorities would resist changes that might create more critical and independent citizens. Commercial interests would resist changes that might reduce the supply of compliant workers and consumers. Educational reform would require overcoming the resistance of powerful groups who preferred the status quo. But Orwell believed that such reform was essential for creating a truly democratic society. Education was too important to be left to educators alone. It required the active participation of parents, communities, and democratic institutions. It required constant vigilance against attempts to use schools for political indoctrination or commercial manipulation. Most importantly, it required a commitment to the principle that all children, regardless of their social background, deserved an education that would enable them to develop their full potential as human beings. This was both a moral imperative and a practical necessity for any society that wanted to remain free and prosperous. Part 18. Human Nature, Psychology, and the Possibilities of Change. George Orwell had a complex and nuanced understanding of human nature that avoided both naive optimism and cynical pessimism. He believed that human beings were capable of both extraordinary goodness and extraordinary evil, often within the same individual. What determined which tendencies predominated was not some fixed essence of human nature, but rather the social, political, and economic conditions under which people lived. Change those conditions, and you could change human behavior in fundamental ways. This insight was crucial to his political philosophy because it meant that social reform was possible without requiring the impossible task of transforming human nature itself. People could become better or worse depending on the institutions and incentives that shaped their daily lives. Orwell's understanding of human psychology was shaped by his direct observation of people under extreme conditions. During his time as a colonial policeman in Burma, he saw how the imperial system corrupted both the rulers and the ruled. During his investigations of poverty in Paris, London, and northern England, he observed how economic desperation affected people's capacity for moral behaviour. During the Spanish Civil War, he witnessed how political conflict brought out both heroic sacrifice and savage cruelty in ordinary individuals. These experiences taught him that human behaviour was far more variable and context-dependent than most political theorists assumed. People were not naturally good or naturally evil, but naturally adaptable to whatever circumstances they found themselves in. This psychological insight explained why political institutions were so important. Institutions that rewarded cooperation, honesty, and mutual aid would tend to produce cooperative, honest, and helpful people. Institutions that rewarded competition, deception, and selfishness would tend to produce competitive, deceptive, and selfish people. The same individuals who behaved generously under one set of conditions might behave cruelly under different conditions. This meant that social reform should focus on changing institutional incentives rather than trying to change individual hearts and minds. Create the right conditions and good behaviour would tend to emerge naturally. But Orwell also understood that human psychology included certain universal tendencies that had to be taken into account by any realistic political program. People seemed to have a natural desire for status and recognition that could be channeled in either constructive or destructive directions. They had a tendency to form group loyalties that could promote solidarity within groups while creating hostility between groups. They had a capacity for self-deception that allowed them to maintain comfortable beliefs even when those beliefs contradicted obvious evidence. They had a need for meaning and purpose that could be satisfied by either noble causes or destructive obsessions. These psychological patterns were not necessarily problems to be solved, but rather features of human nature that had to be accommodated and channeled wisely. The desire for power was particularly important in Orwell's analysis of human psychology. He observed that some people seemed to be driven by an insatiable hunger for control over others. This was not simply a means to achieve other goals like wealth or security, but an end in itself. Such people were attracted to political movements and institutions that offered opportunities to exercise power over others. They were skilled at manipulating idealistic rhetoric to justify their pursuit of domination. They could be found in movements across the political spectrum, from fascist parties to communist organizations to democratic institutions. The presence of power-hungry individuals in political movements created a constant danger that noble ideals would be corrupted by base motives. People who joined movements to fight injustice might find themselves serving leaders whose primary goal was personal advancement. Revolutionary organizations dedicated to human liberation might become vehicles for establishing new forms of oppression. Democratic institutions designed to serve the public interest might be captured by special interests seeking private advantage. The only defense against this corruption was constant vigilance and institutional safeguards that limited the power of any individual or group. Human nature made both freedom and tyranny possible, and the outcome depended on the wisdom of institutional design. Orwell was particularly interested in the psychology of intellectual and moral submission. He observed that many people seemed to prefer being told what to think rather than thinking for themselves. Independent judgment was difficult and often lonely, while conformity provided the comfort of belonging to a group. This psychological tendency made people vulnerable to manipulation by charismatic leaders and totalitarian movements. They would surrender their individual judgment in exchange for the security of having their beliefs and values determined by external authorities. This submission was often voluntary and even enthusiastic rather than forced. The appeal of totalitarian ideologies lay partly in their ability to satisfy this psychological need for intellectual certainty and moral guidance. They offered simple answers to complex questions and clear direction for confused individuals. They promised to eliminate the anxiety and uncertainty that came with individual responsibility for moral and political choices. They provided a sense of meaning and purpose that many people found lacking in liberal democratic societies. The price of this psychological comfort was the surrender of individual freedom, but many people were willing to pay that price. They preferred slavery with certainty to freedom with responsibility. But Orwell also observed that human beings were capable of remarkable courage and independence under the right circumstances. Ordinary people could resist overwhelming pressure when they had something important to protect. They could maintain their integrity in the face of torture and death when their core values were at stake. They could think clearly and act wisely, even in chaotic and dangerous situations. The capacity for heroism existed alongside the capacity for cowardice in the same individuals. Which tendency prevailed depended partly on external circumstances and partly on the moral education and preparation that people had received earlier in their lives. This complex understanding of human psychology led Orwell to reject both utopian and dystopian political programs. Utopian schemes that assumed people would naturally behave altruistically were doomed to failure because they ignored the reality of human selfishness and power hunger. Dystopian acceptance of injustice was equally mistaken because it ignored the human capacity for moral growth and social cooperation. Realistic political programs had to work with human nature as it actually existed rather than as reformers wished it to be. They had to create institutional incentives that channeled selfish motives in constructive directions while providing opportunities for altruistic impulses to flourish. The goal was not to perfect human nature, but to create conditions under which the better angels of human nature would have the best chance to prevail. Part 19. Meaning, Mortality, and the Secular Search for Purpose. George Orwell was an atheist who nevertheless understood the profound human need for meaning and purpose that traditional religion had historically provided. He rejected the supernatural claims of organized religion, but recognized that human beings could not live by reason alone. People needed sources of value and significance that transcended their immediate material interests. They needed reasons to sacrifice for others and to work for goals they would not live to see achieved. The decline of religious faith in modern societies created a spiritual vacuum that political movements and ideologies had rushed to fill. Orwell understood that this vacuum was both an opportunity and a danger for human civilization. Orwell's own loss of religious faith occurred gradually during his adolescence and early adulthood. He had been raised in the conventional Christianity of the English middle class, but his experiences in Burma and his investigations of poverty undermined his belief in a benevolent deity. If God existed, how could such obvious injustices be allowed to persist? If the Church was truly concerned with human welfare, why did it so often side with the powerful against the powerless? These questions led him to embrace a humanistic worldview that placed human welfare rather than divine command at the center of moral reasoning. People mattered because they were people, not because they were created in God's image or destined for eternal life. But Orwell recognized that this shift from religious to secular values created new problems as well as solving old ones. Religious belief, whatever its intellectual difficulties, had provided people with a sense of cosmic significance and ultimate purpose. It had given them reasons to behave morally even when morality conflicted with their immediate interests. It had offered comfort in the face of suffering and hope in the face of death. Secular humanism could provide rational justifications for moral behavior, but it could not easily provide the emotional satisfaction and psychological security that religion had offered. Many people found secular life empty and meaningless, even when it was prosperous and free. This spiritual emptiness made people vulnerable to political movements that promised to restore meaning and purpose to their lives. Fascism and communism both functioned as secular religions that offered their followers a sense of cosmic significance and historical mission. They promised that individual sacrifice would contribute to the achievement of ultimate goals like racial purity or classless society. They provided rituals, symbols and ceremonies that satisfied the human need for transcendent experiences. They created communities of belief that offered the same social and psychological benefits that religious congregations had traditionally provided. For many people, these political faiths filled the void left by the decline of traditional religion. But Orwell understood that political religions were even more dangerous than traditional religions because they claimed authority over this world rather than the next. Religious authorities who promised rewards and punishments in an afterlife could not verify their claims in this life. Political authorities who promised utopia on earth could always argue that their failures were temporary setbacks rather than fundamental errors. They could demand infinite sacrifice from their followers in pursuit of goals that would always remain just out of reach. The result was often fanaticism and cruelty that exceeded anything seen in traditional religious conflicts. Political religions combined the irrationality of faith with the immediacy of worldly ambition. Orwell believed that healthy societies needed to find ways of providing meaning and purpose without resorting to totalitarian ideologies or returning to supernatural beliefs. This required developing forms of secular spirituality that could satisfy human needs for transcendence without sacrificing intellectual honesty or individual freedom. Art, literature, music and philosophy could provide experiences of beauty and meaning that enriched human life without requiring false beliefs about the nature of reality. Science could offer a sense of wonder and discovery that satisfied the human curiosity about the universe. Democratic participation could give people a sense of agency and purpose in shaping their collective future. Personal relationships could provide love and connection that made individual life worth living. The key was to find sources of meaning that were compatible with truth rather than requiring the denial of evidence or the suppression of critical thinking. Traditional religions had often demanded faith in propositions that contradicted observable reality. Political religions demanded loyalty to leaders and ideologies that produced obvious failures and contradictions. Secular humanism could offer meaning based on values that could be defended through reason and experience. Compassion for suffering was meaningful because suffering was real. The pursuit of truth was meaningful because truth made life better for human beings. The creation of beauty was meaningful because beauty enriched human experience. These values did not require supernatural justification because their worth was evident in their consequences. Orwell also understood that mortality gave urgency and poignancy to human life that eternal existence could never provide. The fact that individual lives were brief and fragile made them precious in ways that immortal existence could not be. The knowledge that time was limited forced people to make choices about what was truly important. The inevitability of death created bonds of sympathy between all human beings who shared the same ultimate fate. Rather than making life meaningless, mortality gave it meaning by making every moment irreplaceable and every choice consequential. The secular appreciation of life's brevity could be more profound than religious promises of eternal continuation. This acceptance of mortality had political implications as well as personal ones. If this life was all that people had, then improving the conditions of this life became a moral imperative rather than a distraction from higher purposes. Reducing suffering became urgent because suffering was not compensated by future rewards. Creating justice became essential because there was no cosmic justice that would eventually balance all accounts. Building a better world became the responsibility of each generation because no external agency would do the work for them. Secular humanism demanded more rather than less commitment to human welfare than religious worldviews that promised ultimate redemption. But Orwell also recognized that secular meaning was more fragile and uncertain than religious meaning. It required constant effort to maintain and could be easily lost during times of crisis or despair. It depended on social and cultural institutions that were themselves vulnerable to political and economic pressures. It could not promise the ultimate triumph of good over evil that religious faith offered to believers. Secular individuals had to find ways of living with uncertainty and ambiguity that religious believers could avoid through faith. This was both the burden and the nobility of the humanistic worldview. The challenge for secular societies was to create cultures that could sustain meaning and purpose without resorting to false certainties or oppressive orthodoxies. This required tolerance for different approaches to the question of meaning, while maintaining commitment to shared values like truth, freedom, and human dignity. It required institutions that protected individual liberty while fostering social solidarity. It required education that developed both critical thinking and moral imagination. Most importantly, it required individuals who could find significance in the ordinary business of human life without needing cosmic validation or eternal duration. This was perhaps the most difficult, but also the most important task facing modern civilization. Part 20. Technology, Modernity, and the Future of Human Freedom. George Orwell understood that the 20th century marked a fundamental turning point in human history. For the first time, technological developments were advancing faster than human wisdom about how to use them responsibly. New forms of communication, transportation, production and warfare were creating possibilities for both liberation and oppression that previous generations could never have imagined. The same technologies that could eliminate scarcity and connect all human beings in a global community could also create forms of surveillance and control that would make traditional tyrannies seem benevolent by comparison. The future of human freedom would depend on whether democratic societies could learn to master these technologies before the technologies mastered them. This was the central challenge of the modern age. Orwell witnessed the early stages of this technological revolution during his lifetime. Radio and cinema were creating new forms of mass communication that could reach millions of people simultaneously. Aviation and mechanized warfare were transforming the nature of military conflict. Industrial production was creating unprecedented material abundance alongside new forms of social organization. Each of these developments changed the balance of power between individuals and institutions in ways that had profound political implications. Technologies that had initially seemed neutral or beneficial often revealed hidden capacities for oppression when they were fully deployed. The key insight that Orwell contributed to thinking about technology and politics was his recognition that technological capabilities would inevitably be used for political control if no deliberate effort was made to prevent such use. Technologies did not automatically serve human freedom simply because they were invented by free societies. They would be adapted to serve the needs of whoever had the power to control their development and deployment. In authoritarian societies, this meant that new technologies would be used to strengthen authoritarian control. In democratic societies, the outcome was less certain but equally important. Democratic control over technology required constant vigilance and active effort to ensure that technological development served democratic values. The relationship between technology and freedom was complicated by the fact that technological progress often created genuine benefits alongside new dangers. Mass communication technologies could spread propaganda and surveillance, but they could also spread education and democratic participation. Transportation technologies could enable military conquest and population control, but they could also facilitate trade and cultural exchange. Production technologies could create economic dependence and environmental destruction, but they could also eliminate scarcity and reduce human toil. The same technological capabilities could serve multiple purposes, depending on how they were organized and controlled. The political challenge was to gain the benefits while avoiding the dangers. Orwell predicted that future conflicts would increasingly be fought over the control of information rather than the control of territory or resources. Whoever could shape what people believed about reality would ultimately control how they behaved in reality. This made mass communication technologies into weapons that were potentially more powerful than military weapons. A government that could control all sources of information could manipulate public opinion in ways that made traditional forms of political opposition impossible. People would support policies that harmed their own interests because they would not understand what those policies actually entailed. Democracy would become a facade that concealed the reality of information-based tyranny. But Orwell also understood that information technologies could serve democratic purposes if they were structured to promote rather than restrict the free flow of ideas. Multiple competing sources of information could provide checks against propaganda and misinformation. Technologies that enabled two-way communication could empower ordinary citizens to participate in political discussions rather than simply receiving messages from authorities. Global communication networks could make it difficult for any single government to maintain complete control over information within its borders. The same technologies that could create unprecedented oppression could also create unprecedented opportunities for democratic participation. The outcome would depend on the institutional frameworks within which these technologies were developed and used. Orwell was particularly concerned about the psychological effects of technological change on individual human beings. Modern life was becoming increasingly complex and fast-paced in ways that made it difficult for people to think clearly about important questions. The constant bombardment of information and stimulation was overwhelming people's capacity for reflection and contemplation. They were losing the ability to concentrate on single tasks or to pursue long-term goals that required sustained effort. They were becoming dependent on external technologies for functions that human beings had traditionally performed for themselves. This psychological dependence made them more vulnerable to manipulation and less capable of independent judgment. The pace of technological change was also creating social and cultural instability that made people anxious about the future and nostalgic for an imagined past. Traditional ways of life were being disrupted faster than new ways of life could be established and tested. People felt disoriented and rootless in ways that made them susceptible to authoritarian movements promising to restore order and meaning. The benefits of technological progress were unevenly distributed, creating new forms of inequality alongside new forms of abundance. Those who could not adapt to technological change were left behind economically and socially. These disruptions created political instability that could undermine democratic institutions. Orwell believed that managing technological change in ways that preserved human freedom would require new forms of democratic participation and control. Technical decisions could not be left entirely to technical experts because those decisions had profound political and social implications. Citizens needed to understand enough about technology to participate meaningfully in debates about how it should be developed and used. Democratic institutions needed to develop new mechanisms for overseeing technological development and ensuring that it served public rather than private interests. International cooperation would be necessary to address technological challenges that crossed national boundaries. Most importantly, societies needed to develop clear values and principles to guide their technological choices, rather than simply pursuing technological capabilities for their own sake. The ultimate question that Orwell posed about technology and modernity was whether human beings could maintain control over their own creations. Each technological advance created new capabilities that changed the conditions of human life in unpredictable ways. The cumulative effect of these changes might be to transform human nature itself in directions that current generations could not foresee or control. Future human beings might be as different from current human beings as current human beings are from their pre-technological ancestors. Whether this transformation would represent progress or decline would depend on whether it enhanced or diminished the qualities that make human life worth living. The preservation of human freedom, dignity and moral agency in a technological age would require wisdom, courage and constant vigilance from every generation. Part 21. Work, Labour and Human Dignity. George Orwell understood that how a society organises work determines not just its economic productivity, but the character and dignity of its people. Work is where most human beings spend the majority of their waking hours. It shapes their relationships with others, their sense of purpose and their understanding of their own worth. When work is organised in ways that treat people as machines or commodities, it damages their capacity for independent thought and moral action. When work is organised in ways that respect human dignity and encourage human development, it becomes a source of fulfilment and social connection. The transformation of work was therefore central to any meaningful social reform. Orwell's understanding of work was shaped by his direct experience of manual labour during his investigations of poverty in Paris and London. He worked as a dishwasher in expensive restaurants where he observed the hidden world that made middle-class comfort possible. He saw how working people were treated by their employers and customers. He experienced the exhaustion, stress and humiliation that came with jobs that offered no security, no respect, and no opportunity for advancement. Most importantly, he learned how economic desperation could force people to accept working conditions that violated their basic human dignity. Poverty was not just about lacking money, but about being forced to surrender your autonomy and self-respect in order to survive. What disturbed Orwell most about capitalist work arrangements was how they separated people from the products of their labour. Workers in factories and restaurants performed repetitive tasks without understanding or controlling the larger purposes those tasks served. They became human cogs in machines that they did not own and whose operations they could not influence. This separation alienated them from their own productive capacities and made work feel meaningless even when it was socially necessary. They lost the satisfaction that comes from creating something useful and beautiful. Work became simply a way of earning money rather than a way of contributing to human welfare. The division of labour that made industrial production efficient also created rigid hierarchies that divided people into different classes with different life experiences. Those who did mental work looked down on those who did manual work. Those who owned capital looked down on those who sold their labour. Those who made decisions looked down on those who implemented decisions. These divisions created psychological barriers that prevented people from recognizing their common humanity. They lost the ability to understand and empathize with people whose work experience was different from their own. But Orwell also observed that people retained their dignity and creativity even under the worst working conditions. The dishwashers and coal miners he worked alongside developed informal systems of mutual support and resistance that helped them maintain their humanity. They found ways to take pride in their work even when that work was undervalued by society. They created communities of solidarity that provided meaning and purpose beyond their individual economic interests. They demonstrated that human dignity could not be completely destroyed by oppressive economic arrangements. This resilience gave Orwell hope that better working conditions could unleash human potential that was currently being wasted. Orwell's vision of democratic socialism was largely about transforming work relationships to respect human dignity and encourage human development. Workers should have control over their working conditions and a voice in decisions about production. They should be able to see the connection between their individual efforts and the larger social purposes those efforts served. They should have opportunities for education and advancement that allowed them to develop their full potential. Most importantly, they should be treated as human beings rather than as production inputs. Work should serve human development rather than forcing human development to serve production requirements. This transformation would require more than just changing ownership structures. It would require rethinking fundamental assumptions about the purposes of economic activity. Instead of organizing production to maximize profit for owners, societies should organize production to maximize welfare for everyone. Instead of treating efficiency as the highest value, they should balance efficiency with other values like creativity, security, and community. Instead of accepting inequality as an inevitable result of market competition, they should actively work to ensure that everyone had access to meaningful work and decent living standards. These changes would require both institutional reforms and cultural transformations. Orwell understood that technology could either make work more humanizing or more dehumanizing depending on how it was developed and deployed. Machines could eliminate dangerous and repetitive tasks while freeing people for more creative and fulfilling activities. But they could also be used to monitor and control workers more intensively than any previous system of labour management. The key was to ensure that technological development served human needs rather than forcing human needs to serve technological requirements. This required democratic participation in decisions about technological development rather than leaving those decisions to technical experts and private owners. Workers should have a voice in determining how technology was used in their workplaces. The ultimate goal was to create a society where everyone could contribute their talents and efforts to the common good while also developing their own potential as human beings. Work should be a source of satisfaction and social connection rather than a necessary evil that people endured in order to survive. This did not mean that all work would be easy or pleasant, but it did mean that all work would be recognized as valuable and that all workers would be treated with respect. The dignity of labour would be matched by the dignity of labourers. This transformation was both a practical economic goal and a moral imperative for any society that claimed to value human equality and freedom. Without it, democracy would remain incomplete and social justice would remain elusive. Part 22. The Intellectual and the Common Man. George Orwell spent much of his career exploring the complex relationship between intellectuals and ordinary people in modern democratic societies. He belonged to the intellectual class himself, but was deeply critical of its tendency toward arrogance, abstraction, and disconnection from common human experience. At the same time, he recognized that intellectuals had important responsibilities that could not be fulfilled by anyone else. They were the custodians of culture, the critics of power, and the guardians of truth in societies that were constantly threatened by propaganda and manipulation. The challenge was to find ways for intellectuals to fulfill these responsibilities without losing touch with the people they were supposed to serve. This required a fundamental transformation in how intellectuals understood their role and their relationship to society. Orwell's criticism of intellectuals was based on his observation that they often lived in social and cultural bubbles that isolated them from the consequences of the ideas they promoted. University professors could advocate for radical economic experiments without having to live under the conditions those experiments created. Literary critics could celebrate artistic movements that had no connection to the actual needs and interests of ordinary readers. Political theorists could develop abstract philosophical systems without considering how those systems would affect real people in real situations. This isolation made intellectuals dangerous because it allowed them to treat human beings as means to achieve theoretical ends rather than as ends in themselves. They lost sight of the human purposes that intellectual activity was supposed to serve. The problem was compounded by intellectuals' tendency to develop their own specialized languages and concerns that were incomprehensible to non-intellectuals. Academic disciplines created jargon that obscured rather than clarified important ideas. Intellectual debates became focused on questions that mattered only to other intellectuals rather than on questions that affected ordinary people's lives. Complex theoretical distinctions replaced simple moral judgments about right and wrong. This specialization served the professional interests of intellectuals by making their expertise seem essential, but it also isolated them from the broader public they were supposed to enlighten. They became a separate caste with its own interests and loyalties. Orwell was particularly critical of intellectuals who adopted political positions based on abstract, theoretical commitments rather than concrete human consequences. He watched Western intellectuals defend Stalin's regime because it seemed to represent the correct theoretical position about socialism, even when the actual results were mass murder and oppression. He saw conservative intellectuals defend imperial policies because they fit abstract theories about civilization and progress, even when those policies caused enormous human suffering. In both cases, intellectuals were more loyal to their ideas than to the people those ideas were supposed to serve. They had forgotten that political theories were tools for improving human life, not ends in themselves that justified any means necessary to achieve them. This confusion of means and ends was both intellectually corrupt and morally dangerous. But Orwell also recognized that intellectuals had essential functions that could not be performed by anyone else. They were responsible for preserving and transmitting the cultural heritage that gave meaning and continuity to human civilization. They were the critics who exposed the lies and contradictions of powerful institutions and individuals. They were the teachers who helped people understand complex ideas and develop their own capacity for critical thinking. They were the writers and artists who captured and expressed the full range of human experience. Without intellectuals performing these functions effectively, societies would lose their capacity for self-reflection and self-correction. The key was for intellectuals to perform these functions in ways that served ordinary people rather than just other intellectuals. This required them to write and speak in language that was accessible to non-specialists. It required them to focus on questions that mattered to people's actual lives rather than just to academic debates. It required them to test their ideas against reality rather than defending them through increasingly complex theoretical arguments. Most importantly, it required them to remain humble about the limitations of their knowledge and the fallibility of their judgment. Intellectual sophistication should lead to greater wisdom about the complexity of human problems, not to greater arrogance about one's ability to solve those problems. Orwell believed that intellectuals could learn important lessons from ordinary people if they were willing to listen with humility and respect. Common sense often provided better guidance than elaborate theories when it came to practical questions about how to live and work together. Ordinary people's direct experience of economic and social conditions often gave them insights that were missed by intellectuals who studied those conditions from a distance. The values and priorities of common people were often more sound than the abstract principles developed by professional theorists. Intellectuals who ignored or dismissed popular wisdom were cutting themselves off from important sources of truth and understanding. They were also ensuring that their ideas would have no practical influence on the world. At the same time, Orwell understood that ordinary people could benefit from the knowledge and perspective that intellectuals provided. Complex modern societies created problems that could not be solved through common sense alone. Understanding economics, politics, science and culture required specialized knowledge that most people did not have time to acquire. Intellectuals could serve as interpreters and guides who helped ordinary people understand forces and trends that affected their lives, but were not immediately visible to them. The relationship between intellectuals and common people should be one of mutual respect and mutual learning, rather than condescension in either direction. Both groups had essential contributions to make to the common enterprise of building a better society. This ideal relationship could only be achieved if intellectuals abandoned their sense of superiority and ordinary people gained more access to education and cultural resources. Intellectuals needed to remember that their specialized knowledge was a privilege that carried responsibilities rather than an achievement that conferred status. Ordinary people needed opportunities to develop their own intellectual capacities rather than simply deferring to expert authority. Education should be available to everyone regardless of their social background. Cultural institutions should serve the public rather than just the educated elite. The goal should be to eliminate the artificial barriers between intellectuals and common people while preserving the real benefits that intellectual activity could provide to society as a whole. Part 23. Art, Beauty and the Defense of Civilization. George Orwell believed that art and beauty were not luxuries that civilized societies could enjoy after solving their practical problems. They were essential elements of human life that gave meaning and value to all other activities. A society that neglected art in favor of purely utilitarian concerns would eventually lose its humanity, even if it achieved material prosperity. At the same time, art that ignored moral and political realities would become irrelevant to the urgent needs of people struggling for justice and freedom. The challenge was to create forms of art that were both aesthetically satisfying and morally engaged. This required rejecting false oppositions between beauty and truth, between artistic quality and political relevance. Orwell's own artistic practice demonstrated how political commitment could enhance rather than diminish aesthetic achievement. Animal Farm worked as political allegory precisely because it worked first as a compelling story about recognizable characters facing universal problems. 1984 created a lasting vision of totalitarian horror because it grounded abstract political concepts in concrete human experiences. His essays about language and politics were persuasive because they were written with clarity, precision, and literary skill. In each case, the political message gained power from the artistic quality of its expression. Good politics required good art, and good art required honest engagement with political realities. But Orwell understood that totalitarian movements posed a special threat to artistic freedom and creativity. They sought to subordinate all forms of cultural expression to their ideological requirements. Art became propaganda, literature became indoctrination, and beauty became whatever served the party's current needs. Artists were required to produce works that glorified the regime and demonized its enemies. Any expression of individual vision or independent judgment was seen as a form of political disloyalty. The result was not just bad politics, but bad art that served neither aesthetic nor moral purposes effectively. Orwell observed this process in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, where talented artists were forced to produce work that violated their artistic integrity. Some of them fled to freer societies where they could continue their creative work. Others tried to find ways of expressing their vision within the constraints imposed by political authorities. Still others surrendered their artistic independence entirely and became willing servants of totalitarian propaganda. In each case, the subordination of art to political control impoverished both the art and the politics. Societies that could not tolerate independent artistic expression eventually lost their capacity for independent thought in all areas of life. This is why Orwell insisted that artistic freedom was essential for political freedom. Art provided a space where individual vision and imagination could flourish without being subjected to collective control. It preserved ways of seeing and feeling that might be suppressed by dominant political and social forces. It offered experiences of beauty and meaning that transcended immediate political conflicts and concerns. Most importantly, it demonstrated that human beings were capable of creating something valuable for its own sake, rather than as a means to achieve other goals. This capacity for disinterested creation was one of the things that distinguished human beings from machines and made human life worth preserving. But Orwell also warned against the opposite extreme of treating art as completely separate from moral and political concerns. Artists who claimed to be above politics were often unconsciously serving the interests of whoever benefited from the status quo. Art that ignored injustice and suffering was complicit in perpetuating those conditions. Beauty that was purchased at the cost of human misery was not genuine beauty but a form of moral corruption. True artistic integrity required engagement with the full range of human experience, including its painful and disturbing aspects. Artists had a responsibility to bear witness to the realities of their time, even when those realities were ugly and uncomfortable. The key was to find forms of artistic engagement that preserved artistic integrity while serving moral purposes. This required artists who were committed to truth rather than propaganda, to human complexity rather than ideological simplicity. It required audiences who were willing to encounter challenging and disturbing artistic visions, rather than demanding easy comfort and reassurance. It required cultural institutions that supported artistic independence while encouraging social responsibility. Most importantly, it required societies that valued both beauty and justice and understood that neither could be achieved without the other. Art and morality were not competing claims, but complementary aspects of human flourishing. Orwell believed that exposure to great art could educate people's moral sensibilities in ways that abstract ethical instruction could never achieve. Literature could teach empathy by allowing readers to experience life from perspectives very different from their own. Visual art could train people to see beauty and meaning in aspects of experience they had previously ignored. Music could provide emotional experiences that expanded people's capacity for feeling and expression. These aesthetic experiences were not substitutes for moral reasoning, but they provided the emotional foundation that made moral reasoning possible. People who had never experienced beauty would have difficulty understanding why beauty was worth preserving. This is why Orwell placed such emphasis on making art accessible to ordinary people, rather than restricting it to educated elites. Everyone needed access to beauty and cultural expression, not just those who could afford expensive educations or leisure time. Public institutions should support art that served the general welfare rather than just private tastes. Education should include artistic and cultural components that developed people's aesthetic sensibilities alongside their practical skills. The goal was not to turn everyone into artists, but to ensure that everyone had opportunities to experience and appreciate the best that human creativity had produced. This democratic approach to culture was essential for creating societies that valued human dignity and individual development. But Orwell also understood that genuine art could not be created by committee or produced on demand. It required individual vision, personal inspiration, and the freedom to explore ideas and experiences that might not have immediate practical applications. Societies that tried to control artistic production too closely would end up with propaganda rather than art. The best way to encourage great art was to create conditions where artists could work freely while ensuring that their work could reach audiences who would appreciate and benefit from it. This required balancing artistic freedom with social responsibility, individual expression with collective welfare. The balance was delicate and constantly changing, but getting it right was essential for preserving both artistic excellence and human civilization. Part 24. The Future of Democracy in an Age of Crisis. George Orwell lived through a period when democratic institutions were under assault from both fascist and communist movements that promised more efficient and decisive forms of government. He witnessed the collapse of democratic governments across Europe as they proved unable to address economic crises, social conflicts, and military threats. But rather than losing faith in democracy, Orwell concluded that the problem was not with democratic principles, but with how those principles were being implemented. Democracy could survive and flourish, but only if it was reformed and strengthened to meet the challenges of the modern world. This required both institutional changes and cultural transformations that would make democratic participation more meaningful and effective. The future of human freedom depended on getting these reforms right. The central weakness that Orwell identified in existing democratic systems was their failure to achieve genuine equality of participation. Formal political rights meant little when economic inequality prevented most people from exercising those rights effectively. The wealthy could buy political influence through campaign contributions, lobbying and media ownership, while ordinary workers struggled to make their voices heard. Education systems produced graduates who were trained to follow orders rather than to think critically about political questions. Information systems were controlled by powerful interests that shaped public opinion to serve their own purposes rather than the public interest. Under these conditions, democracy became a facade that concealed the reality of oligarchic rule. Orwell believed that addressing these problems would require extending democratic principles from politics into economics. People who had no control over their working conditions or economic security could not participate as equals in political decision-making. They were too dependent on powerful employers and too worried about immediate survival to take the risks that effective political participation required. Economic democracy was therefore a prerequisite for political democracy rather than a luxury that might be added later. This meant that democratic reform would have to address questions of ownership, control and distribution of economic resources. Political equality and economic equality were inseparable aspects of a truly democratic society. But Orwell also understood that democracy faced new challenges in the 20th century that previous generations of democratic reformers had not anticipated. The scale and complexity of modern societies made direct participation by all citizens in all decisions impossible. Representative institutions were necessary, but they created their own problems of accountability and responsiveness. Professional politicians developed interests that diverged from those of their constituents. Bureaucratic institutions became powerful in their own right and resistant to democratic control. The pace of technological and social change made it difficult for democratic institutions to adapt quickly enough to address emerging problems. These challenges were compounded by the rise of mass communication technologies that could be used to manipulate public opinion on an unprecedented scale. Radio, cinema, and eventually television gave those who controlled these media enormous power to shape how people understood political issues. Sophisticated propaganda techniques could manufacture consent for policies that served elite interests while appearing to respond to popular demands. The line between information and manipulation became increasingly blurred as advertising methods were applied to political communication. Democratic decision-making became impossible when citizens could not get accurate information about the choices they were being asked to make. Protecting the integrity of public discourse became as important as protecting the mechanics of voting and representation. Orwell believed that meeting these challenges would require new forms of democratic participation that went beyond traditional electoral politics. Citizens needed opportunities to participate directly in decisions that affected their daily lives, rather than simply choosing between candidates who might or might not represent their interests. Workplace democracy, community organizing, and local self-government could provide training grounds for the skills and attitudes that broader democratic participation required. People needed to experience democracy as a way of life rather than just as a periodic ritual of voting. This kind of participatory democracy would be more demanding than representative democracy, but it would also be more effective at achieving genuine self-government. It would create citizens rather than just voters. Education was crucial to this democratic transformation. People could not participate effectively in democratic decision-making unless they understood the issues they were deciding about and the processes through which decisions were made. This required not just literacy and numeracy, but critical thinking skills that enabled people to evaluate competing claims and detect manipulation attempts. It required historical knowledge that helped people understand how current problems had developed and what solutions had been tried before. It required scientific literacy that enabled people to understand technological and environmental issues that affected public policy. Most importantly, it required moral education that developed people's capacity for empathy, fairness, and concern for the common good. But Orwell also understood that democratic institutions were inherently fragile and required constant vigilance to maintain. Each generation had to learn democratic values and practices anew because they were not automatically inherited. Powerful interests would always try to subvert democratic processes to serve their own purposes. Crisis situations would create pressures to abandon democratic procedures in favor of more efficient authoritarian methods. The temptations of nationalism, racism, and other forms of group hatred would constantly threaten the tolerance and mutual respect that democracy required. Preserving democracy was not a task that could be completed once and for all, but an ongoing responsibility that required effort from every citizen. The ultimate test of democratic institutions would be their ability to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their essential principles. Technological developments would create new possibilities for both democratic participation and authoritarian control. Globalization would require new forms of international cooperation that transcended traditional national boundaries. Environmental challenges would demand long-term planning and sacrifice that democratic politicians often found difficult to implement. Economic inequality would continue to threaten political equality unless it was actively addressed through democratic institutions. Success in meeting these challenges would determine whether democracy remained a viable form of government or gave way to new forms of authoritarianism that might be more efficient but would also be less human. Orwell's vision of democracy was therefore both hopeful and sobering. He believed that ordinary people were capable of governing themselves wisely if they were given the tools, information, and opportunities that effective self-government required. But he also understood that creating and maintaining those conditions would require constant effort and vigilance against forces that preferred more hierarchical and controlled forms of social organization. Democracy was not the natural state of human societies, but an artificial achievement that had to be consciously created and continuously renewed. The price of democratic freedom was not just eternal vigilance, but eternal work to make democratic ideals into democratic realities. This work was both the burden and the privilege of citizenship in a free society. Part 25. The Enduring Legacy, Orwell's Vision for Human Freedom. As we reach the end of our journey through George Orwell's complete philosophical system, we can see how all of his ideas fit together into a unified vision of human possibility. Every aspect of his thinking, from his theories about language to his critiques of power, from his economic analysis to his psychological insights, served a single overarching purpose. He wanted to understand what conditions would allow human beings to live with dignity, freedom, and genuine happiness. He wanted to identify the forces that prevented such conditions from emerging and to suggest ways that those forces might be overcome. His entire intellectual career was devoted to this practical, moral question of how to create a world worth living in. This is what makes his work so enduringly relevant to anyone who cares about the future of human civilization. Orwell understood that human freedom was not a natural condition that would automatically emerge if external constraints were removed. Freedom had to be actively created and constantly defended against forces that would destroy it. These forces were not just external enemies, like totalitarian governments or oppressive economic systems. They included internal enemies like intellectual laziness, moral cowardice, and the human tendency to surrender individual judgment to collective authority. The most important battles for freedom were fought not on political battlefields, but in the minds and hearts of individual human beings. Every person who chose truth over comfort, who resisted manipulation, who thought independently about important questions, was contributing to the defense of human freedom. This insight led Orwell to place enormous emphasis on individual responsibility within larger social and political movements. He rejected both the individualism that ignored social forces and the collectivism that dissolved individual responsibility into group membership. People were shaped by their circumstances, but they also had the capacity to resist and reshape those circumstances through their choices and actions. Social change required both institutional reform and personal transformation. Better institutions could encourage better behavior, but better behavior was also necessary to create and maintain better institutions. The relationship was circular and required effort at both individual and collective levels. Orwell's vision of a free society was therefore both radical and conservative. It was radical in its commitment to equality, democracy, and social justice. It demanded fundamental changes in how economic and political power were distributed and exercised. It required challenging entrenched interests and transforming institutions that had existed for centuries. But it was conservative in its respect for human nature, cultural traditions, and the accumulated wisdom of ordinary people. It sought to preserve what was valuable in existing ways of life while eliminating what was oppressive and unjust. This balance between radical change and conservative preservation was reflected in Orwell's approach to every major issue he addressed. He wanted to transform economic relationships but preserve cultural continuity. He wanted to extend democracy but protect individual rights. He wanted to use technology for human benefit but maintain human control over technological development. He wanted to promote international cooperation but preserve local autonomy. He wanted to expand education but maintain respect for common sense and practical wisdom. In each case, he sought solutions that maximized human freedom and dignity rather than pursuing abstract ideological goals. His politics were practical and humanistic rather than theoretical and systematic. Perhaps the most important insight that Orwell offers to our current moment is his understanding that the struggle between freedom and tyranny is never finally won or lost. Each generation faces this struggle in new forms that require new responses. The specific threats to human freedom change over time, but the underlying dynamics remain constant. Those who have power will always try to expand and consolidate that power. Those who benefit from existing arrangements will always resist changes that might threaten their advantages. Those who are comfortable will always be tempted to ignore the suffering of those who are not comfortable. The only defense against these tendencies is constant vigilance and active resistance by people who value freedom more than security, truth more than comfort, and justice more than order. This vigilance cannot be delegated to others, but must be exercised by each individual in their own sphere of activity. Orwell's work also demonstrates the crucial importance of intellectual honesty in political life. Most of the political disasters he witnessed were caused not by evil intentions, but by the willingness of otherwise decent people to accept convenient lies rather than inconvenient truths. Intellectuals who ignored the crimes of movements they supported, politicians who promised things they knew they could not deliver. Citizens who believed what they wanted to believe rather than what the evidence actually showed. Each small compromise with truth made larger compromises easier until the very concept of truth lost its meaning. The defense of truth therefore became a political act of the highest importance. People who insisted on accuracy, precision and honesty in public discourse were defending the foundations that made democratic discussion possible. But perhaps Orwell's greatest contribution was his demonstration that ordinary human decency was more important than any sophisticated political theory, the capacity to recognize suffering and want to relieve it. The ability to treat other people as ends in themselves rather than as means to achieve other goals. The willingness to tell the truth even when it was politically inconvenient. The courage to stand up for principles even when it was personally costly. These simple human virtues were more valuable than all the complex ideological systems that claimed to offer scientific solutions to political problems. A society of people who practiced common decency would be more free and just than a society that implemented the most sophisticated political theory but ignored basic human needs and rights. This was both a humble and a radical insight that challenged the pretensions of intellectuals while affirming the wisdom of ordinary people. The world that George Orwell envisioned was not a utopia where all human problems had been solved. It was a world where human beings could live with dignity, express themselves freely, work meaningfully, and participate as equals in the decisions that affected their lives. It was a world where truth was valued more than power, where individual conscience was respected even when it conflicted with collective opinion, and where the future remained open to human choice rather than being determined by impersonal forces. This world was achievable, but only through the conscious effort of people who understood what was at stake and were willing to work for something better than what they had inherited. Today, more than 70 years after Orwell's death, his vision remains as relevant as ever. The specific forms of the threats he identified have evolved, but the underlying dangers persist. New technologies create new possibilities for both liberation and oppression. New economic arrangements create new forms of inequality alongside new forms of abundance. New political movements promise easy solutions to complex problems while demanding the surrender of critical thinking. New forms of propaganda exploit psychological weaknesses that Orwell identified decades ago. But Orwell's work also shows us that these challenges can be met if we have the wisdom to learn from his insights and the courage to act on them. The future of human freedom depends not on the actions of great leaders or the operations of large institutions, but on the daily choices of ordinary people who decide whether to think for themselves or let others think for them. Whether to tell the truth or accept convenient lies. Whether to stand up for their principles or go along with the crowd. Whether to work for justice or simply pursue their own interests. These individual choices, multiplied across millions of people, will determine whether the 21st century becomes an age of expanding human freedom or an age of sophisticated tyranny. George Orwell gave us the tools we need to make these choices wisely. He showed us how to recognize manipulation and resist it. He taught us how to defend truth against those who would distort it. He demonstrated how to maintain individual integrity while participating in collective action. He revealed how to love your country without hating other countries. He explained how to pursue social justice without sacrificing individual freedom. Most importantly, he proved that one person committed to truth and human decency could make a difference in the struggle between freedom and tyranny. His life and work remain an inspiration and a guide for anyone who refuses to accept that things must continue as they are. The final lesson of Orwell's philosophy is that the choice between freedom and tyranny is made new every day by every person. No victory is permanent, and no defeat is final. The work of building a free and just society must be done again by each generation. This is both the burden and the privilege of being human in a world where the future remains open to our choices. George Orwell showed us what that work requires and why it matters. Now it is up to us to continue that work in our own time and in our own way. The struggle between truth and power continues. The outcome depends on us.